I never expected my solo camping trip to go the way it did. I'd planned everything down to the last detail. The gear, the route, the weather forecast, and even the meals. I just wanted to escape the noise of my everyday life and spend a weekend in the quiet of nature. The woods had always been a place where I could clear my head and feel a sense of peace. But that peace turned into something else entirely. Something darker and much more unsettling. The drive out to the trailhead was uneventful. The roads were long and empty, winding through small towns and fields that seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I reached the gravel parking lot at the edge of the forest, it was mid-morning. The sun was high, casting long shadows from the trees that lined the trail. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked my car, and headed into the woods. The first few hours were perfect. The trail was well maintained, and the air was crisp with that earthy smell of damp leaves and pine. I'd picked a lesser-known area to avoid crowds, and it seemed to have worked. I didn't see another soul. Occasionally, I'd stop to take a sip of water or snap a photo of a particularly beautiful view. A clearing filled with wildflowers, a stream cutting through moss-covered rocks, or the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy above me. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I'd chosen to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by towering trees. The sound of the water was calming, and the ground was flat and soft enough for my tent. I unpacked my gear and got to work, pitching the tent, unrolling my sleeping bag, and setting up a small cooking area with my portable stove. As evening fell, I cooked a simple meal of dehydrated pasta and sat by the creek to eat. The forest around me began to change with the fading light. The cheerful chirping of birds was replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It wasn't eerie, not yet, just different, quieter, more alive in a way that felt ancient and untamed. After cleaning up and securing my food to keep it out of reach of wildlife, I settled into my tent to read for a bit. The battery-powered lantern cast a warm glow, and the sound of the creek outside lulled me into a sense of calm. Eventually, I turned off the light and let myself drift off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face. The only sound was the creek. No wind, no animals, nothing else. I lay there, trying to figure out what had stirred me. Maybe it was just a dream or the unfamiliarity of sleeping outdoors. Then I heard it, a faint noise, barely audible over the creek. It sounded like a branch snapping, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. My heart started to race. It could have been a deer or some other animal, but something about the rhythm of the steps felt deliberate. Human. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped just outside my tent. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I lay perfectly still, trying to decide what to do. My headlamp was within reach, along with the small camping knife I always kept with me. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound that would give away that I was awake. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Couldn't tell. The footsteps moved again, this time circling my tent slowly. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot, the sound of someone or something deliberately walking around me. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker, a ranger, or something more sinister. I decided I couldn't just lie there. Slowly, as quietly as I could, I reached for the knife and the headlamp. My fingers fumbled with the switch, and the beam of light suddenly cut through the darkness as I turned it on. I unzipped the tent and shone the light outside, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The trees stood silent, their shadows stretching long and dark in the artificial light. I scanned the area, moving the beam of the headlamp back and forth, but there was no sign of anyone. No movement, no sound except the creek. I stepped out of the tent, clutching the knife tightly. The air was cold against my skin, and every nerve in my body was on high alert. I walked a few steps away from the tent, shining the light into the woods. Still nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on me. I retreated to the tent and zipped it shut, securing it as best as I could. Sleep was out of the question. I sat there in the dark, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of someone or something outside. Hours seemed to pass. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to filter through the fabric of the tent, and with it came a sense of relief. Whatever had been out there was gone, or so I hoped. I packed up camp quickly, skipping breakfast in my haste to get back to the trail. I wanted to be out of those woods as soon as possible. The hike back to the car was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone darting behind a tree or standing silently in the distance. But there was never anyone there. When I finally reached the parking lot, I almost cried with relief. My car was just as I'd left it, and I wasted no time tossing my gear into the back and getting behind the wheel. As I drove away, the tension in my chest began to ease, but the questions remained. Who or what had been outside my tent that night? Why had they been there? And what would have happened if I hadn't woken up? Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about it. I've gone over every detail in my mind, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just another camper, curious or lost. Maybe it was my imagination, playing tricks on me in the dark. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Something was there, something real, and the thought of it still sends a chill down my spine. It was supposed to be just a weekend getaway, a simple camping trip with some friends, the kind of thing we did every year. We all piled into cars, loaded up with gear, and headed into the woods, far from the distractions of the city. There were no cabins or designated campgrounds, just tents, a campfire, and the wilderness. This time, we were in a remote spot, deep in the forest. We'd been here once before, but that was years ago, and I didn't remember much about the place except that it was quiet, peaceful, and beautiful. We set up camp near a small creek. The air was crisp, the trees towering above us like silent guardians. Felt right, the perfect place to disconnect. We were a few hours from any town, no cell service, just us and nature. I've always loved being out here, away from the noise of everyday life. But this time, something felt different. At first, it was just little things that I couldn't shake off. Sounds that seemed out of place, distant rustling noises in the trees when there was no wind, or a shadow darting between the trees just at the edge of my vision. I brushed it off. It was probably just animals, or my imagination playing tricks. We were camping, after all. You're supposed to feel a little on edge. As the sun set, the sky turned a deep, blood-red orange. The fire crackled in front of us, its warmth a welcome contrast to the cool night air. We sat around, roasting marshmallows and telling stories, just like we always did. But as the night wore on, I started feeling a growing unease. The woods around us seemed to close in, as if the trees were watching us. The shadows deepened, and the forest, once so peaceful, felt strangely suffocating. I tried to shake it off, but it was hard to ignore the sensation that someone was out there, lurking in the dark. I wasn't the only one who felt it. I could see it in my friends' eyes too. They were nervous, glancing over their shoulders every so often, not quite meeting each other's gaze. Then it happened. The first thing I noticed was the silence. 1 minute, the forest had been alive with the sounds of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant call of an owl. But suddenly, everything stopped. There was no sound at all, not even the wind. It was as though the entire forest had gone still, holding its breath. I could feel my heart rate pick up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I looked around, trying to figure out what was going on, but I couldn't see anything unusual. No animals, no movement, just the dark, silent trees surrounding us. My friends must have felt it too, because they all stopped talking and sat frozen, eyes wide, scanning the edges of the firelight. It was then that I heard it, a faint sound like footsteps, crunching leaves, a soft tread on the forest floor. It came from somewhere to the left, just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but then it stopped and there was a long pause. It felt too deliberate, too controlled. I glanced at my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. Or maybe they were pretending not to. I stood up slowly, my breath catching in my throat. Did anyone else hear that? I whispered. No one answered, but I could see the same tension in their faces that I felt in mine. Something was out there and it was getting closer. I moved cautiously toward the edge of the firelight, my eyes scanning the darkness. I could see nothing, but the air felt heavy. I took another step, and that's when I heard it again. This time louder, closer. The unmistakable sound of someone moving through the woods, deliberate and slow. I froze, heart racing. I turned back toward the camp, but my friends were no longer in the same relaxed position. They were all standing now, staring into the darkness as though waiting for something to emerge. I could feel it too, a strange, gut-wrenching sense that we were not alone. Then a twig snapped. It wasn't just any snap. It was the kind of snap that could only come from something heavy stepping on it. Something human-sized, something deliberate. We all stood there paralyzed. And that's when I saw it. A shape moving just out of the firelight, slipping between the trees. It was too tall to be an animal, and it moved too smoothly, like it knew exactly where it was going. I don't know why, but my feet started moving before I could think. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the shape. For a moment, the beam caught nothing but empty trees and shadows. But then it flashed on something else. Something that made my blood run cold. A figure, a man. Or at least I thought it was a man. He was standing just at the edge of the light, his face obscured by the darkness. I couldn't see any details, just the silhouette of someone tall, broad-shouldered, and still. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move. It didn't acknowledge the light, didn't flinch, didn't do anything at all. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around, grabbed my friends, and told them we needed to go now. They were frozen at first, eyes wide, mouths agape, but they eventually snapped out of it and followed me toward the tents. We packed as fast as we could, fumbling with our gear in the panic. The tension was thick, like the air itself was charged. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig made us jump. The footsteps, those slow, deliberate steps, followed us. I tried to keep it together, to focus, but every movement we made felt like it was echoing through the forest, amplifying the dread that was steadily crawling up my spine. It was like we were being herded, like whatever was out there wanted us to leave, or worse, wanted to catch us. I didn't know how long it took to break down the camp, but it felt like forever. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on us. Every so often, I'd glance toward the trees, half expecting to see the figure again, but nothing. Just shadows, dark and heavy. Finally, we were packed up, and we started moving quickly toward the car, hearts pounding, legs shaking. We didn't look back, didn't say a word, just kept walking as fast as we could. It wasn't until we reached the clearing where we had parked the cars that we dared to stop. We were all panting, adrenaline still surging through us. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just a trick of the mind, the dark, maybe even an animal playing tricks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something out there, something watching us. We piled into the cars and drove off without a word, the headlights cutting through the thick night. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the trees, but there was nothing, just the empty road behind us. As we drove farther from the woods, the tension slowly started to ease. We were safe, and for the first time since we'd set up camp, I could breathe again. But even now, as I sit here and think about it, I can't shake the feeling that we weren't meant to leave. Something was out there in those woods, something that didn't want us there, and I have no idea what it was. But I do know this: I'm never going camping again. Not there. Not in any forest like that. Some places aren't meant to be explored. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound breaking the stillness as I made my way deeper into the forest. The trail had been quiet for hours with no sign of other hikers. That was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, peace, and the chance to clear my head. Life back in the city had been relentless lately, and this solo camping trip was my escape. My backpack felt heavy, even though I'd packed light: a tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, a knife, and a first aid kit. I'd hiked this trail once before, years ago, but only for a day trip. This time, I planned to spend 2 nights out here. I'd scoured maps and online forums to pick a spot far off the main trail where I'd be unlikely to run into anyone else. By late afternoon, I reached the area I'd marked on my map. The trees here were dense, their tall trunks forming a canopy that let through only scattered shafts of sunlight. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I found a small clearing near a stream, a perfect spot to set up camp. The stream was narrow but flowed steadily, its water crystal clear. It would be my source for drinking water and cooking. I pitched my tent quickly, practiced from years of weekend camping trips. The ground was soft but dry, and I secured the stakes firmly. I gathered some rocks to create a fire pit, then collected dry wood and kindling from the forest floor. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Dinner was simple: a freeze-dried pasta meal rehydrated with boiling water. I ate it by the small fire I'd built, listening to the soft gurgle of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. As darkness settled in, the forest around me came alive with the sounds of insects and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. I felt a deep sense of calm, the kind that only comes from being far away from the noise and chaos of civilization. After cleaning up and securing my food in a bear-proof bag hung high in a tree, I crawled into my tent. The thin nylon walls felt flimsy against the vastness of the wilderness, but they were enough to keep out the bugs and the chill. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the weight of the day's hike pulling me into sleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness that makes you feel like you're floating in a void. My watch read 2:13 a.m. I lay still, straining to hear something over the pounding of my heart. It was then that I noticed the absence of the usual forest sounds. The insects had gone silent, and even the stream seemed quieter than before. I told myself it was nothing. Animals move through the forest at night, and their presence can cause other creatures to go quiet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My instincts, honed by years of camping, were telling me to stay alert. Eventually, the sounds of the forest returned, and I managed to drift back to sleep. When I woke again, it was dawn. The air was cold and crisp, and a light mist hung over the ground. I shook off the unease from the night before, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite, carrying only a day pack with water, snacks, and my knife. The forest here was beautiful, with towering trees and patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I followed the stream upstream, stopping occasionally to admire the scenery or take a sip of water. About an hour into my hike, I came across something unexpected. It was a shoe, muddy and partially buried in the soft ground near the stream. It looked old, the kind of heavy-duty hiking boot you'd expect an experienced outdoorsman to wear. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The sole was worn, and the laces were frayed. There was no sign of its owner. I looked around, but there was nothing else nearby. No bag, no clothing, no other footprints in the mud. It was strange, but I figured someone might have lost it while crossing the stream or moving through the area. I left the shoe where I found it and continued on. As the day went on, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. I kept feeling like I was being watched, though every time I turned around, there was nothing but trees and shadows. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was already low in the sky. That evening, I built another fire and tried to relax, but my nerves were on edge. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig seemed amplified, my imagination conjuring images of predators or something worse. I reminded myself that I was alone out here, that there was nothing to fear but my own thoughts. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly. Instead, I lay awake for hours, my ears tuned to every sound. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start to the sound of something outside my tent. It was faint at first, a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart raced as I lay completely still, straining to hear more. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Someone was walking around my campsite. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My mind raced with possibilities. Another hiker? A hunter? Someone who had no business being out here? I waited, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Then silence. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I didn't dare move or make a sound. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away. I waited until I was sure they were gone before unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow over the clearing. There was no one in sight. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I didn't sleep, keeping my knife close and my ears tuned to every sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I didn't even stop to make breakfast. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the forest remained empty, the only sounds the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of a bird. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost brought me to tears. I never found out who or what was outside my tent that night. Maybe it was another camper, though the thought of someone wandering around my campsite in the middle of the night without announcing themselves is unsettling. Maybe it was just an animal, though the deliberate footsteps suggested otherwise. Whatever it was, it reminded me of something important. The wilderness is unpredictable. It's beautiful and serene, but it's also indifferent. Out there, you're vulnerable in a way you rarely feel in everyday life. I still love camping, but now I'm more cautious. I double-check my gear, choose campsites closer to established trails, and always trust my instincts. The forest may be peaceful, but it's never entirely safe. It started as a simple camping trip, a way to get away from the grind of daily life. I've been planning it for weeks. The thought of being surrounded by trees, breathing in crisp air, and falling asleep to the sound of a crackling fire seemed like the perfect escape. I chose a remote spot deep in the woods, far from other campers or any kind of civilization. It was exactly what I needed: solitude. I packed everything carefully: my tent, a sleeping bag, plenty of food and water, a map, a compass, and a first aid kit. I even brought along a small emergency radio, though I doubted I'd need it. The trail to the campsite was a 5-mile hike from where I parked my car, and the further I walked, the more isolated I felt. The trees grew thicker, the air cooler, and the sounds of the outside world faded until all I could hear was the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of leaves. The campsite was perfect. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. A stream ran nearby, its gentle gurgling adding to the peaceful atmosphere. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and had a quick meal of trail mix and jerky before settling in for the night. As the firelight danced against the dark silhouettes of the trees, I felt a sense of contentment. This was exactly what I'd been craving. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up to the sun filtering through the trees, the air cold enough to see my breath. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The map I had marked a few points of interest: a small waterfall about a mile away and an abandoned cabin even further out. The waterfall sounded more appealing, so I set off, leaving most of my gear at the campsite. The hike was easy, and the waterfall was beautiful. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and the sound of it crashing into the rocks below was soothing. I spent an hour there, taking photos and enjoying the solitude. On my way back to camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I'd occasionally stop and look around, convinced I'd heard something. A twig snapping, the faint crunch of leaves. But every time I turned, there was nothing but trees. Back at camp, I told myself I was overthinking. It's easy to get spooked when you're alone in the woods, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds. I focused on gathering more firewood and preparing dinner. By the time the sun began to set, I'd almost convinced myself that the uneasy feeling was just my imagination. That night, things changed. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, though I didn't know why. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the forest was pitch black. I stayed still, straining to hear what might have woken me. At first, there was nothing but the usual sounds of the woods: the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But then I heard it, a faint, deliberate sound. Footsteps. They were slow and careful, as if whoever or whatever was making them was trying not to be heard. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the steps sounded too heavy for that. They were human. I lay there, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps moved closer. They circled my campsite, pausing every so often. I thought about calling out, but something stopped me. Instead, I reached for the knife I kept in my pack and clutched it tightly. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the distance, and I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt around my campsite. They were unmistakably human, and they weren't mine. Panic set in as I realized how vulnerable I was. Whoever had been out there had been watching me. I debated packing up and leaving, but the thought of hiking back to my car alone, knowing someone might be following me, was just as terrifying. I decided to stay another night, hoping whoever it was had moved on. I spent the day on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. I stayed close to camp, not wanting to stray too far. As the sun set, I built the biggest fire I could and sat with my back to a tree, knife in hand. I told myself it was just one more night, and I'd leave at first light. That night was worse. I heard the footsteps again, this time earlier in the night. They were closer, more deliberate. Whoever it was didn't seem to care about being quiet anymore. My heart pounded as I listened to them circle the campsite, stopping just outside the ring of firelight. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I stayed frozen, gripping the knife, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then it did. A rock came flying out of the darkness, landing with a thud near the fire. I jumped to my feet, adrenaline coursing through me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going and sat with my back to the tree, knife in hand, until the first light of dawn. As soon as it was bright enough to see, I packed up my gear and started the hike back to my car. Every step of the way, I felt like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and drove away. As the trees thinned and the road opened up, I felt a wave of relief. I was safe. It wasn't until I got home and unpacked my gear that I noticed something chilling. My map, which I'd left at the campsite, was in my pack. And it wasn't how I'd left it. There was a circle drawn around my campsite, and next to it, in small, scrawled writing, was a single word: soon. I don't go camping anymore. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision to go camping. After weeks of work, stress, and staring at screens, I needed the quiet of the woods. Just me, a tent, and the sounds of nature. The idea was simple: escape for a weekend, reset my mind, and return feeling refreshed. I'd been camping before, so I didn't think much about the details. I packed the basics: a tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a knife, and drove out early Saturday morning to a state forest I'd heard about but never explored. The trailhead was empty when I arrived. I wasn't surprised. It was mid-October, and the temperature had dropped enough to deter casual campers. I liked it that way. Fewer people meant more solitude. The air was crisp, the trees shedding the last of their autumn leaves, the ground scattered with reds, yellows, and browns. I strapped on my pack, locked my car, and started hiking. The trail wound through the forest, uneven but well-marked. It was about 6 miles to the clearing I'd chosen for my campsite, a small spot beside a creek I'd found on a map. The hike in was uneventful. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of squirrels or the distant call of birds. I passed a few abandoned fire pits and old campsites but saw no one else. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The clearing was perfect. The creek ran clear and cold, bubbling over smooth rocks. The ground was flat, and there was enough space to set up my tent without being too exposed. I pitched the tent quickly, gathering some fallen branches and rocks to make a small fire pit. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had a modest fire going, the warmth pushing back the evening chill. Dinner was simple: a can of chili heated over the flames and a couple of granola bars. After eating, I leaned back against a log, staring up at the sky. Without city lights, the stars were brighter than I'd seen in years. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness, and for the first time in a while, I felt at peace. It was around midnight when I decided to call it a night. The fire had died down to embers, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. The sounds of the creek and the faint rustling of leaves lulled me to sleep. I don't know what woke me. One moment I was asleep, and the next, I was wide awake, heart pounding in the silence. At first, I thought it was just the unfamiliarity of being alone in the woods, but then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone or something was moving outside my tent. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise, and turned it on. The beam illuminated the inside of the tent, but I couldn't see anything outside. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, holding my breath, listening. Minutes passed, and the forest was silent again. Telling myself it was nothing, I eventually lay back down, though sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle, every crack of a twig set my nerves on edge. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted. The next morning, I stepped outside to find the campsite as I'd left it, or so I thought. Near the edge of the clearing, the ground was disturbed. The leaves had been kicked aside, revealing patches of dirt. Could have been an animal, but the pattern looked too much like footprints. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to distract myself. I followed the creek upstream, climbed a small ridge for a better view, and took pictures of the autumn foliage. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was setting again. I built another fire, cooked dinner, and tried to relax. The woods felt different that night, though. The quiet was heavier, the darkness deeper. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the firelight. Around midnight, I went to bed, leaving the knife within easy reach. This time, I fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion from the night before catching up with me. But once again, I woke in the middle of the night. This time, the sound wasn't footsteps. It was a low, distant noise, like something scraping against wood. Stopped, then started again, closer. I sat up, heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. The sound stopped as soon as I turned it on. I waited, listening, but the woods were silent. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the tent and shone the beam outside. The clearing was empty, the trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. But something caught my eye. A fresh scratch on the tree closest to my tent, the bark gouged as if by a knife or a claw. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn appeared, I decided to pack up and leave. The unease I'd felt since the first night had grown into something I couldn't ignore. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest seemed quieter than before, the usual sounds of birds and squirrels absent. When I finally reached my car, relief washed over me. I tossed my pack in the trunk, climbed in, and locked the doors. Driving away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The forest receded into the distance, the trees standing silent and still. I never saw anyone, never heard anything concrete, but the feeling stayed with me. Even now, back in the comfort of my home, I can't shake the memory of those nights. The footsteps, the scratches, the oppressive silence. It all lingers, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't explain. I never considered myself much of a camper, but I let my friend, Jason, talk me into it. He couldn't make it last minute, but I had already packed my gear and cleared my weekend. Figured, why not? Some solitude in the woods sounded like a decent way to disconnect. The spot Jason had recommended was deep in the mountains, about a 4-hour drive from the nearest town. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing off an old dirt trail that wound through the dense forest. The kind of place you wouldn't find unless someone told you about it. I had a map he'd drawn, marking the location and a rough sketch of the path. The drive up was uneventful, though the final stretch was a little nerve-wracking. The dirt road was narrow with steep drop-offs on one side. Loose gravel crunched under my tires, and every so often, I had to swerve to avoid potholes. By the time I reached the trailhead, my knuckles were white, and my heartbeat was a little faster than normal. The trail itself was overgrown but manageable. The first couple of miles were peaceful, just the sound of my boots crunching leaves and the distant chatter of birds. I'd packed light: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, some food, and a knife I'd borrowed from Jason. My plan was to hike to the clearing, set up camp, and spend the night stargazing. Simple enough. It took me about an hour and a half to reach the spot. The clearing was exactly as Jason had described. A small patch of flat ground surrounded by towering pines. The trees formed a natural wall, their branches tangled high above, blocking out most of the sunlight. In the center of the clearing was a fire pit, probably left by previous campers. I dropped my pack, took a deep breath, and got to work setting up camp. By the time I'd pitched the tent and gathered some firewood, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. The shadows in the forest grew longer, stretching like fingers across the ground. I lit a small fire, sat back, and let the quietness of the place settle over me. The world felt distant, like I'd stepped into another time or dimension. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirped in a steady rhythm, and the occasional rustle in the bushes reminded me I wasn't alone out there. I tried to convince myself it was just squirrels or raccoons. The fire crackled, and the warmth felt good against the chilly night air. I ate a simple dinner of granola bars and jerky, washed it down with water, and leaned back against a log to gaze at the stars. Around midnight, I started to feel the weight of the day. My eyelids grew heavy, and the fire had burned down to embers. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay there listening to the forest. The sounds outside were amplified in the silence. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was a sound, or maybe it was just that strange sense you get when something feels off. I lay there for a moment, staring at the roof of the tent, trying to place what was wrong. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. The crickets had stopped chirping, and the usual rustling was gone. All I could hear was the faint breeze brushing through the trees. I sat up slowly, my pulse quickening. The flashlight was within reach, and I grabbed it, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness inside the tent, illuminating my gear. Everything looked normal, but the unease gnawed at me. I strained to listen, my ears searching for any hint of sound. Then I heard it, a faint crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was distant at first, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal, but the sound grew closer, steady, deliberate, not the erratic movements of a deer or a raccoon. Someone or something was walking. I debated what to do. My first instinct was to stay quiet and hope whoever it was would pass by. But the footsteps didn't fade. They were circling the clearing, slow and methodical. My heart was pounding now, every beat echoing in my ears. I reached for the knife, clutching it tightly as if it would make a difference. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a soft rustling sound. Took me a second to realize it was coming from the edge of the clearing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I heard what sounded like someone, or something, picking through the pile of firewood I'd gathered earlier. I'm not sure what compelled me to do it, but I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, casting long shadows. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel their presence. The fire pit, the firewood, everything was as I'd left it. But the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen tension. I ducked back into the tent, breathing shallowly. Whoever it was, they were still out there, watching. I couldn't stay in the tent forever. If they meant to harm me, I'd be a sitting duck. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I try to scare them off? Make a run for it? I didn't have any answers, just a growing sense of dread. Hours seemed to pass. The footsteps came and went, fading into the distance and then returning. At some point, they stopped altogether. I stayed awake, gripping the knife, listening to the forest gradually come back to life. The crickets resumed their song, and the wind rustled the trees as if nothing had happened. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of the tent, blinking against the pale light. The clearing looked untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I packed up quickly, my movements hurried and clumsy. The trail back to the car felt longer than I remembered. Every sound made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the car, I tossed my pack into the back seat and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and drove away, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by people and noise. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just another camper, curious or lost. Or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I don't think I ever want to again. Camping alone might sound peaceful, but I've learned it's a gamble. Out there, in the vastness of the wilderness, you're reminded of how small and vulnerable you really are. The sun was low in the sky, painting the forest in golden light as I set up camp. I had hiked deep into the mountains, far away from the nearest town or paved road. This was my escape, a weekend alone in the wilderness. I needed the quiet, the solitude, the simplicity. The world had been too loud lately, and my head had been even louder. The spot I chose was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a clear, icy stream trickling nearby. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft chirping of birds. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and built a small fire. Dinner was simple: a packet of instant noodles and a protein bar, washed down with water from the stream that I'd boiled to be safe. The heat of the fire warmed my hands as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest shifted into twilight. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirped in unison, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. I stared into the flames, letting my thoughts wander. This was what I'd come for, to disconnect from everything and just be present in the moment. But as the fire burned low and the shadows around me deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. It started as a faint noise, barely audible over the crackling fire and the symphony of insects, a rustling, like leaves shifting underfoot. I froze, straining my ears. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. The forest was full of life after all. But the sound didn't fade. It seemed deliberate, like footsteps, slow, careful. I turned my head sharply, scanning the tree line. The firelight didn't reach far, and beyond its glow, the forest was an inky black void. My heart thudded in my chest as I reached for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. Nothing, just the tall pines standing silent and still. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd let my imagination get the better of me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my gut. I decided to call it a night, convincing myself that I'd feel better inside the tent. I doused the fire, plunging the clearing into darkness, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The nylon walls of the tent felt thin, almost useless as a barrier between me and whatever was out there. I zipped the door shut and lay down, trying to ignore the sounds of the forest outside. The rustling came again, closer this time. My breath hitched, and I lay perfectly still, every muscle tensed. It wasn't constant, just a step here, a step there, followed by long stretches of silence. I clenched the flashlight in my hand, debating whether to unzip the tent and shine it outside. But what would I even do if I saw something, or someone? The sound stopped, and the forest was quiet again. Too quiet. The crickets had gone silent, and even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. I listened intently, my ears straining for any hint of movement. Minutes passed, then an hour. Slowly, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke with a start sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had jolted me awake. The forest was still dark, the faint outline of the trees barely visible through the thin fabric of the tent. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound, something brushing against the tent. My blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal. Couldn't be. Animals didn't move like this, didn't linger like this. My mind raced through possibilities. Person, but who and why? I forced myself to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe it was a stray camper who had gotten lost, or a hunter passing through. Maybe they'd seen my fire and decided to check it out. The brushing stopped, and I held my breath, waiting. A shadow passed over the thin fabric of the tent. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was outside might hear it. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my other hand reaching for the small camping knife I'd packed. My fingers closed around the handle, and I felt a small surge of confidence. At least I wasn't completely defenseless. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound steady. "Who's there?" No response, just silence. The shadow lingered for a moment longer, then disappeared. I waited, my ears straining for any sound, but none came. After what felt like an eternity, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The clearing was empty, no signs of anyone or anything. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I stepped out cautiously, knife in hand, and scanned the area. Nothing seemed out of place, but the uneasy feeling in my gut remained. I circled the campsite, shining the flashlight into the trees, but found no tracks, no broken branches, no signs that anyone had been there. I returned to the tent, my nerves on edge. Sleep was out of the question now. I sat inside, clutching the knife and flashlight, my back against the tent wall. The hours dragged by, and the night seemed endless. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. I told myself that morning would come soon, that everything would feel different in the light of day. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. The golden light seeped through the trees, and the forest came alive again with the sounds of birds and insects. I stepped out of the tent, exhausted but determined to shake off the fear that had gripped me all night. I decided to pack up and head back early. The solitude I'd sought no longer felt comforting. It felt dangerous. As I packed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the ground, just a few feet from the tent, were footprints. Human footprints. They circled the tent, overlapping in places, as if whoever had been there had been pacing, watching. My hands trembled as I stuffed my gear into my backpack. Whoever had been out there had been close. Too close. I left the campsite in a hurry, my eyes scanning the trees as I walked. The trail back to the car felt longer than it had on the way in, every snap of a twig making me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was following me, just out of sight. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors as soon as I was inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I didn't relax until I was miles away from the trailhead, the dense forest shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never found out who or what had been out there that night. Maybe it was a lost hiker too afraid to approach. Maybe it was someone with less innocent intentions. The not knowing is what haunts me the most. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will. I don't know why I agreed to go camping alone that weekend. Maybe it was the stress from work, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself I could do it. Either way, I found myself packing up my gear and heading toward the dense woods of Pine Hollow. It wasn't my first time camping, but it was my first time doing it solo. Looking back, I should have taken more time to plan. The forest was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that's almost unnatural. I parked my car on the gravel pull-off near the trailhead, double-checking that everything I needed was in my pack. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, knife, flashlight, extra batteries. I'd read enough horror stories to know better than to skimp on essentials. Still, there was a part of me that felt uneasy, like I was forgetting something. The trail started off easy enough, winding through towering pines and patches of wildflowers. The sun was still high, filtering through the canopy in golden beams. I kept a steady pace, the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt path the only sound for miles. Felt good at first, liberating even. Just me and the wilderness, no emails, no deadlines, no endless noise of the city. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a spot that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was a small clearing bordered by trees on 3 sides, with a little stream trickling nearby. The ground was flat, and there was enough open sky above for stargazing later. I pitched my tent quickly, the practiced motions of assembling poles and securing stakes almost automatic. Once everything was set up, I sat down on a fallen log to eat a snack. The granola bar tasted dry, but I barely noticed. I was too busy taking in the surroundings, the way the light shifted as the sun dipped lower, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. By the time I finished eating, the shadows had grown long. I decided to gather some firewood before it got too dark. I didn't stray far from the campsite, sticking within sight of the tent as I picked up sticks and branches. The forest seemed to shift as the light faded, the vibrant greens and browns turning into muted grays. It was strange how quickly the place went from inviting to intimidating. Back at the campsite, I got a fire going. The flames crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the trees around me. I sat close to the fire, warming my hands and watching as the sky turned from deep blue to black. The stars were stunning, more than I'd ever seen in the city. I tried to focus on the beauty of it, but that uneasy feeling from earlier crept back. The forest felt too quiet. No owls hooting, no crickets chirping, just silence, broken only by the occasional crack of the firewood. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere. The chances of someone else being out here were slim. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I turned in earlier than I'd planned, crawling into my sleeping bag and zipping the tent shut tightly. The inside of the tent felt claustrophobic. I lay there in the darkness, listening to every little sound outside. Most of it was probably just the wind or animals moving through the underbrush, but every now and then, there was a noise I couldn't explain. A twig snapping too close to the tent, the faint rustle of leaves where there shouldn't have been any movement. I gripped my flashlight like a lifeline, ready to flick it on at the first sign of trouble. Somehow, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, it was still dark. For a moment, I wasn't sure what had woken me, but then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. They were close, too close. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, then started again, circling the tent. Whoever it was, or whatever it was, wasn't in a hurry. It felt like they were taking their time, deliberately testing my nerves. I reached for the knife in my pack, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it an animal? Person? What did they want? I considered calling out, but fear kept me silent. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded into the distance. I didn't move for a long time, too afraid to even breathe. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent, knife in hand. The forest looked completely different in the daylight, less menacing but no less eerie. I searched the area around my campsite, looking for any signs of who or what had been there. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints, leading away from my tent and disappearing into the trees. My stomach churned. Whoever had been there wasn't lost or passing through. They'd been watching me. I packed up camp in record time, my hands shaking as I shoved gear into my bag. Every noise in the woods set me on edge. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. I didn't even stop for water as I made my way back to the car, pushing myself to move faster despite the weight of my pack and the ache in my legs. When I finally reached the trailhead, I practically ran to my car. The relief I felt when the engine roared to life was overwhelming. I drove away without looking back, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. Even hours later, safely back in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It's been months since that trip, and I haven't been camping since. I've tried to rationalize what happened, telling myself it was probably just another hiker or some harmless prankster. But deep down, I know that's not true. Whoever was out there that night wasn't harmless. They knew I was alone, vulnerable, and they wanted me to know it too. The woods aren't the same to me anymore. They've lost their magic, replaced by something darker, something I can't quite explain. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a much-needed escape from the noise and chaos of city life. I'd planned it meticulously, every detail accounted for. Food, water, camping gear, and the best trails mapped out in the rugged forest I'd read so much about online. I was looking forward to the silence, the kind you can only find deep in nature, where your thoughts don't have to compete with the hum of traffic or the buzz of notifications. Just me, the forest, and the stars. I set out early Saturday morning, driving for hours until the city faded into fields and the fields gave way to dense, towering trees. The parking lot at the trailhead was nearly empty, just one or two other cars, their owners already swallowed by the wilderness. That was exactly what I'd hoped for. I didn't want to see anyone. This trip was about solitude. The trail started easy, winding through clusters of pine and maple, the dirt path soft beneath my boots. The air smelled clean, tinged with pine resin and damp earth. I'd checked the weather forecast repeatedly in the days leading up to the trip, and it promised clear skies all weekend, perfect for camping. After a few hours of hiking, I reached the spot I'd marked on my map, a small clearing near a creek. The sound of water rushing over rocks was soothing, and the trees here formed a natural barrier, making the area feel secluded. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and ate a simple lunch of trail mix and jerky. The rest of the afternoon was spent exploring the area, following the creek upstream and marveling at the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, I was back at camp, building a fire. The flames crackled to life, and I sat there, staring into them, letting my mind wander. It felt good to disconnect, to let go of the constant need to be doing something. Here, in the middle of nowhere, there was nothing to do but exist. As darkness settled in, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, frogs croaked from the creek, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. I wasn't afraid, not yet. I'd been camping before, and these were the sounds I'd expected. They were normal. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., zipping myself into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard, but I'd brought a foam pad to cushion it. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it would do. I lay there, listening to the symphony of the night, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as my mind cleared, I realized it was real. Something was moving outside the tent. My heart started pounding, and I lay completely still, straining to hear. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the crunch of leaves underfoot. My first thought was that it might be an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the sound wasn't random like an animal foraging. It was deliberate, measured. Footsteps. I'd seen no one on the trail all day. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? My pulse quickened as I considered my options. I had a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a small canister of bear spray. None of them felt adequate against the sudden, primal fear coursing through me. The footsteps grew louder, circling the tent. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be stealthy anymore. I reached for the flashlight, my hand trembling, and clicked it on. The beam of light illuminated the tent's nylon walls, but beyond that, I could see nothing. "Hello!" I finally called out, my voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound of someone moving. I held my breath, waiting for a response, but none came. After what felt like an eternity, I unzipped the tent slightly and shone the flashlight outside. The clearing was empty as far as I could tell. No movement, no sign of anyone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting upright in my sleeping bag with the bear spray clutched in one hand and the flashlight in the other. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent my nerves into overdrive. But nothing else happened, and as dawn broke, the fear that had gripped me began to loosen its hold. When the sun was fully up, I stepped out of the tent, scanning the area. There were no footprints around the tent, at least none that I could see. It didn't make sense. I told myself it must have been an animal after all, even if it didn't seem likely. The alternative was too unsettling to dwell on. I considered packing up and heading back to the car, but something stubborn in me refused. I'd come all this way to escape, to find peace, and I wasn't going to let one sleepless night ruin that. I spent the day hiking further along the creek, trying to push the night's events out of my mind. By the time I returned to camp, the sunlight was fading again. I rebuilt the fire, cooked a quick dinner, and sat watching the flames. The woods felt different now, heavier somehow, as if they were watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though logic told me I was. That night, I decided to sleep with the bear spray and flashlight within arm's reach. I'd even set up a makeshift alarm system using my mess kit, a few pots and pans balanced precariously on a log near the tent entrance. If anything came close, the clatter would wake me. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when the sound of metal crashing jolted me awake. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on. The pots and pans were scattered on the ground, but no one was there. The clearing was empty, just like the night before. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up my gear and started the hike back to the car. Every step felt like a marathon. My legs heavy with exhaustion and my mind clouded with paranoia. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, relief washed over me. My car was still there, undisturbed. I loaded my gear, got in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see something. But there was nothing. I've thought about that trip countless times since. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to explain the footsteps, the scattered pots, the overwhelming sense of being watched. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know there's a part of the forest we can't understand, something that exists just beyond the edges of our comprehension. I haven't been camping since. I wasn't new to camping. I'd grown up doing it, weekends with my dad teaching me how to pitch a tent, start a fire, and listen for wildlife in the trees. It always felt peaceful out there, away from the hum of civilization. But this time, things felt different. I don't know if it was the loneliness or just a creeping sense of something off, but by the end of this trip, I'd question if I ever wanted to go camping again. I decided on a solo trip this time, something I hadn't done before. It was late October, and the leaves had turned to bright reds and yellows. The air carried that crisp smell of dying leaves and damp soil. Perfect camping weather, I thought. I chose a spot in a national forest about 3 hours from home, far enough away to feel disconnected but not so remote that it was completely isolated. I planned to hike in about 5 miles to a less traveled area, camp for 2 nights, and hike back. The first day started great. I parked at the trailhead, hoisted my pack onto my back, and set off. The trail was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of squirrels darting through the underbrush. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I felt alive, invigorated by the solitude and the rhythm of my boots crunching against the dirt. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something odd. A single, unlabeled black backpack was lying just off the trail. It looked like it had been there a while. The fabric was faded, and the zippers were caked with rust. Curious, I stopped and crouched down to inspect it. It was empty. No tags, no signs of who might have left it. Just an abandoned pack. I left it where it was, thinking maybe someone had dumped it and moved on. I reached my campsite by mid-afternoon, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. It was picturesque, the kind of spot you'd see on the cover of an outdoor magazine. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and boiled water for a freeze-dried meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped fast. I threw on an extra layer and sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of burning wood and the distant hoot of an owl. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times to the sound of twigs snapping, but it's the forest. Animals are always moving around. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon and drifted back to sleep. By morning, the fire had burned down to embers, and the world was blanketed in a thin layer of frost. I felt refreshed, ready for a day of exploring. After breakfast, I decided to follow the creek upstream, see where it led. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, their branches knitting together like a web. The creek twisted and turned, and I lost track of time as I picked my way over rocks and fallen logs. About 2 miles from camp, I found something that made me stop cold. A campsite, but it wasn't like mine. This one was trashed. A tent lay collapsed and torn, its poles snapped like twigs. Empty cans and food wrappers were scattered everywhere. A sleeping bag was half buried in the dirt, shredded as if by claws. It didn't make sense. If it were an animal, why the mess? Why not just take the food and move on? And where was the person who'd set up camp? I stood there for a long time, the hairs on my neck standing on end. Eventually, I decided to head back. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that I'd let the rangers know when I got out. The walk back to my camp felt longer than it should have. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow deeper. By the time I got back, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. I rebuilt my fire and cooked dinner, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. But as the light faded, the feeling only grew stronger. That night, I couldn't sleep. The forest felt too quiet, like the calm before a storm. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not the erratic scurrying of an animal, but deliberate human steps. My heart pounded as I lay there, straining to hear more. The steps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped. I stayed frozen, every muscle tense, my mind racing. Who was out there? What did they want? Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent and peek out. The fire had burned low, casting just enough light to see the immediate area. There was no one there, but the ground was disturbed, fresh footprints in the dirt leading into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn crept into the sky, I packed up camp. I decided to cut the trip short and head back to the trailhead. The thought of another night out there made my skin crawl. The hike back felt surreal. The forest that had seemed so welcoming now felt oppressive, the trees looming over me like silent witnesses. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. About halfway back, I noticed something on the trail. A piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It was the same color and material as my tent. My stomach dropped. Had someone been at my camp while I was gone? I quickened my pace, practically jogging the last mile to the parking lot. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. But that relief was short-lived. As I unlocked the door and threw my pack inside, I noticed something on the windshield. A single, muddy handprint. It was smudged, the fingers long and thin. I stood there, staring at it, my mind racing. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. I didn't stick around to find out more. I jumped in the car, locked the doors, and sped out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what was out there, but I've decided one thing. I'm done with solo camping. I always thought camping alone would be a good way to clear my head. After all, what better way to reset than to surround myself with nature, away from the noise of daily life? So, I packed my gear one Friday afternoon and drove out to a remote forest that I'd read about online. A place where the trails were less traveled and the campsites felt untouched. The drive was peaceful. 2 hours of winding roads, tall trees lining either side, the occasional glimpse of a deer darting into the underbrush. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dirt path that led to the trailhead. I parked my car in a gravel lot that was empty except for an old, rusted pickup truck, its paint chipped and faded. That should have been my first clue, the idea that someone else might already be out here. But at the time, it didn't bother me. If anything, it felt comforting knowing I wasn't completely alone. I strapped on my pack, double-checked that I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, and started down the trail. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your breath visible even in the faintest light. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals darted through the underbrush. Felt perfect. The trail itself was narrow, barely more than a footpath, and wound deeper into the woods. Every so often, I'd see a marker nailed to a tree, a reassuring sign that I was still on the right track. About an hour in, I reached a small clearing with a fire ring made of stones. Someone else had camped here before. Felt like a good spot, so I set down my pack and began to set up camp. The sun was dipping below the horizon as I worked. The sky turned shades of orange and purple, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground, gathered some firewood from the surrounding area, and got a small fire going. Dinner was a simple meal of instant noodles and beef jerky, but out there it tasted like a feast. By the time I finished eating, the stars were out in full force, dotting the sky like a million tiny pinpricks of light. I sat by the fire for a while, just soaking it all in. The silence, the solitude, it was exactly what I'd been hoping for. But as the fire burned low, a strange feeling crept over me. A sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like an awareness that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. I chalked it up to the natural sounds of the forest at night. The distant hoot of an owl, the occasional crack of a branch. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and settled into my sleeping bag. The fire outside had died down to glowing embers, casting faint shadows against the tent walls. I told myself I was just being paranoid. that the forest, in all its unfamiliarity, was playing tricks on my mind. And eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. A low, rhythmic crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started racing as I lay there, completely still, listening. The sound came closer, then stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but deep down I wasn't so sure. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time felt distorted. Just as I was starting to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer. And then, a sudden tug at the corner of my tent. Not violent, but deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the fabric, expecting it to tear open at any second. But nothing happened. The tugging stopped, and once again, silence. I don't think I slept for the rest of the night. I just lay there, heart pounding, clutching the small pocket knife I kept in my gear. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, half expecting to find tracks or some other sign of what had been out there. But there was nothing, just the remnants of my fire and the untouched forest beyond. I debated packing up and leaving right then and there, but pride got the better of me. I'd come out here to prove something to myself, and I wasn't about to let one restless night scare me off. So, I spent the day hiking, exploring the area around my campsite. The forest was beautiful, with towering pines and moss-covered rocks, the kind of scenery you'd see on a postcard. But I couldn't fully enjoy it. That feeling of unease lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave my side. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already sinking low in the sky. I rebuilt the fire, cooked another simple meal, and tried to relax. But as the night wore on, that sense of being watched returned. I kept glancing over my shoulder, peering into the darkness beyond the firelight. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. And then, just as I was starting to think I was imagining things, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. They were barely more than a silhouette, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was there. My blood ran cold as I stared, frozen, unsure of what to do. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there watching. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The figure remained still, a dark shape against the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward them. For a moment, the beam illuminated the figure. A man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by shadows. And then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest without a word. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound, every shadow, set my nerves on edge. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started the hike back to my car. The trail felt longer on the way back, every step weighed down by the events of the past 2 nights. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure following me. But the forest remained quiet. The only sounds the crunch of my boots on the path and the occasional call of a bird. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was relieved to see my car still there, untouched. But the old pickup truck was gone. The realization sent a chill down my spine. Had it belonged to the man I'd seen? And if so, why had he been out there? What did he want? I didn't stick around to find out. I threw my gear into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the forest and its unanswered questions behind. As the miles stretched between me and that place, I felt the tension in my chest begin to ease. But the memory of that figure, standing silent and still at the edge of the clearing, stayed with me. I haven't been camping since, and maybe I never will. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now feels like a place of hidden dangers. And while I'll never know who that man was or what he wanted, one thing is certain. Some things are better left unknown. I've always been the type to seek adventure, but this camping trip turned into something I'll never forget. It started off simple enough. My friends and I, 3 of us in total, had planned a weekend getaway into the woods. We'd picked a remote spot, far from the usual touristy areas. We didn't even bother to reserve a campsite. This was about disconnecting, truly unplugging, and experiencing the wild. The place we chose was surrounded by towering pines, thick brush, and an eerie silence, only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant animal calls. The sun had just started setting as we hiked in, the sky painted with the soft hues of an orange sunset. We were all feeling the usual excitement, chatting and laughing, oblivious to what the night would hold. We found a clearing by a small stream, the soft trickle of water providing a peaceful backdrop to our evening. We set up camp without a hitch. I focused on getting the fire going while my friends started unpacking the tents. The smell of pine was all around us, and as the fire crackled to life, the shadows began to stretch longer across the forest floor. Perfect spot, I thought. We'll have a good time. But as night deepened, the mood shifted. It wasn't anything immediate, nothing obvious at first, but it was there. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air, thick like fog. The usual chirps and rustling of forest life seemed to fade away, leaving only the occasional snap of a twig or the soft sigh of the wind through the branches. At one point, I thought I heard something moving in the bushes near the fire, but when I looked, nothing was there. The quiet was unsettling. We sat around the fire, joking and eating, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping up on us. I kept scanning the woods, though. It felt like someone or something was watching us. But that's probably just the paranoia that sets in when you're in a place so isolated. "I'm going to bed," one of my friends, Ryan, said after a while, clearly ready to call it a night. "Already?" I asked. It wasn't even that late, but Ryan was always an early sleeper. He gave me a grin.
I'm tired.
"You guys can stay up and scare yourselves all you want." We all laughed, but it felt forced. It was like we were trying to push away the unease in our guts. Ryan disappeared into his tent, leaving me and the other friend, Tom, to stay up by the fire. We tried to continue talking, but the silence outside seemed to press in on us. The woods felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for something. The fire was beginning to die down, and we decided to call it a night. "I'll go first," I said, standing up and grabbing my flashlight. "Keep the fire going for a little longer, okay?" Tom nodded, though his eyes were darting nervously around. I don't think he wanted to be alone out there either. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut behind me. The familiar smell of nylon and sleeping bags usually gave me comfort, but tonight, I felt an unfamiliar tension. The darkness outside felt like it was closing in. I settled into my sleeping bag, trying to push away the unease that had settled deep in my chest. I turned off my flashlight and tried to sleep, but the silence outside made it impossible. Every small noise seemed amplified in the quiet night. Twigs snapping, the distant sound of a branch moving in the wind, or maybe something more. Couldn't tell. Then came a noise that made my heart race. A soft thump, like something heavy had fallen in the brush, followed by a rustle, not the typical wind-blown rustling, but something purposeful, something moving around out there. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. I convinced myself it was just a deer or some other animal. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The rustling was deliberate, like something or someone was circling our campsite. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling. I unzipped the tent slowly, just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The fire was low, but still glowing faintly, casting long shadows on the trees around us. My two friends were asleep in their tents, oblivious. I felt stupid for even considering it, but I stepped outside, trying to shake off the nagging feeling in my gut. The night air was cold, sharp, and unsettling. I scanned the woods around us. It felt like the trees were leaning in, watching. There was no movement, no signs of anything. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a raccoon or a bird, maybe even a falling branch. But then I heard it again. The sound was faint but distinct, footsteps, slow and careful, crunching through the dry leaves. The noise was coming from just beyond the tree-line. I froze. My heart slammed in my chest. I stood motionless for what felt like forever, staring at the darkness. I wasn't sure what I expected to see. A figure? Someone? Or something? Hiding in the trees? I don't know, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, shining it in the direction of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the trees and bushes, but there was nothing. I felt an intense urge to run back to my tent, to zip myself in and pretend nothing was happening. But I didn't. Something in the woods felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I took a deep breath and slowly backed toward my tent. As I did, I heard the sound again. This time, closer, definitely closer. My mind raced, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. My flashlight was useless now. The light was dimming, flickering out of battery. I quickly turned and bolted back to my tent, zipping it shut behind me. I was still shaking as I lay back down, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But the feeling didn't go away. I heard more rustling, more thumping. It was closer, too close, like it was circling us. I wanted to wake up Tom, but I didn't want to scare him. I knew we had to stay calm. It's easy to get paranoid out here. But then I heard something else. A voice. A low, gravelly sound. Almost like a whisper. It wasn't in a language I could understand, and it wasn't coming from any of my friends. It was coming from the woods. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I tried to keep my pulse steady. The voice was faint at first, and then it grew louder, clearer. There were multiple voices, like a dozen people murmuring at once. But they weren't speaking words. They were just sounds, like growls mixed with whispers, coming from deep within the trees. I had no idea what it was, but it was close. I knew we had to leave. The panic set in harder now. I unzipped my tent and crawled out, quietly as I could. My flashlight had died completely. My eyes were struggling to adjust to the darkness, but I could just make out the faint outline of the fire. It was barely a glow now. Tom was still asleep in his tent, and I considered waking him, but the whispers, the low, creepy murmurs, were growing louder. It was like they were coming toward us. I could feel it, the presence in the woods, creeping closer. Every part of me screamed to leave, to run. But there was something holding me back, something that told me I had to stay quiet. I couldn't let the others wake up. It would be harder to explain. It was easier to leave them in the dark for now. I grabbed my bag and, as silently as possible, crept toward the edge of the campsite, where I thought I could make a run for it. Then I heard it. A loud snap of a branch, a sudden rustling of leaves behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. For a moment, there was nothing. But then, right in the shadows, just beyond the firelight, I saw something. It was large, almost humanoid in shape, but not quite. It moved quickly, darting behind a tree, as if it was aware that I had spotted it. I stood frozen, my entire body screaming at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I was pretty sure I'd seen something not human, something lurking out there in the dark. I wanted to yell for Tom and Ryan, but I couldn't. I didn't want to draw whatever it was toward them. All I could do was wait, barely breathing, hoping whatever was out there would move on. Minutes felt like hours. The forest was completely still now, almost unnervingly so. Finally, the silence was broken by another sound. This time, it wasn't from the woods. It came from behind me. Tom, his voice low and groggy, called out, "Is everything okay?" I froze. For a moment, everything was still. I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, and I didn't see any movement in the shadows. Tom stumbled out of his tent, clearly disoriented. "Hey, what's going on?" he asked. I couldn't answer him. I couldn't explain it. All I knew was that whatever was out there, it wasn't safe. "We need to leave," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I grabbed Tom's arm and pulled him toward the trail. We didn't wait for Ryan. I knew he'd follow when he realized we were gone. We didn't even look back. I didn't expect to be scared when I went camping. It was just a weekend thing with a couple of buddies. We had picked an isolated site out in the woods, far from anything that could give us a reason to worry. The kind of place where, if anything went wrong, no one would hear us scream. The hike there had been easy enough. We all laughed and joked about how we were too old for this kind of stuff, but we were still pushing ourselves to enjoy the whole back to nature thing. I remember feeling excited about getting away from everything: work, phones, and the constant buzz of the modern world. Just us, the fire, and the trees. Simple. We had set up camp by the edge of a small creek, a peaceful spot where the sound of running water drowned out the distant highway. The trees were dense here, the kind of thick forest where daylight barely touched the forest floor. As night started creeping in, we gathered around the fire, each of us sipping on a beer or two, making small talk. The fire crackled, and the smell of pine was fresh in the cool evening air. It was about an hour after sunset when things started feeling off. It wasn't anything immediate. No sudden sounds or creepy vibes. Just the feeling that something was a little bit wrong. You know that feeling when the hairs on the back of your neck start to stand up, but you can't pinpoint why? That's how it started for me. I was sitting closest to the fire, watching the flames dance in front of me. To my right, one of my buddies, Matt, was talking about a recent hiking trip. His voice seemed unusually loud, almost too loud for the quiet, still woods around us. My other friend, Alex, was sitting on the other side, leaning back against a log and staring into the dark forest. Every now and then, he'd glance up at the sky, as if looking for something. "Hey," Matt said, interrupting my thoughts. "You guys hear that?" I looked up. The sudden break in the conversation made me realize how quiet the woods had gotten. For a second, I thought I heard a rustling sound. But that was normal, right? Animals and wind in the trees. No big deal. But then there was another noise. Something out there, something bigger than the usual critters. A loud snap of a branch breaking. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect from a squirrel or a deer. The noise was too deliberate, too heavy. I didn't say anything at first. I could see Matt's eyes darting around, his face a little more serious than before. Alex still hadn't moved. He just kept staring into the woods like he was waiting for something. "Maybe it's just an animal," I said, trying to brush it off. "Could be a bear or something." "Bears don't sound like that," Matt replied, his voice low. "That sounded like footsteps." We all sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling louder than the woods around us. I could feel my heart beating faster, a pulse of unease running through me. I tried to focus on the flickering flames, but my mind kept wandering back to the sound. It wasn't natural. It didn't fit the usual rhythm of the forest. It was something else. "Guys," Alex finally spoke, his voice steady but quiet. "I'm not sure, but I think someone's out there." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up at the way he said it. He wasn't joking. He wasn't trying to make us paranoid. He was serious. And the thing was, I couldn't argue with him. I had that same feeling now, like we weren't alone anymore. We all stood up at the same time. The firelight flickered as we moved closer to it, instinctively huddling together. There was no wind to speak of, yet the trees seemed to sway more than usual, like something was moving through them. "Let's go check it out," Matt said, his voice a little too sharp, too eager. "Are you serious?" I asked, my heart racing. "What if it's someone else camping nearby? Then we'll just say hey and move on," he said, trying to sound confident. It didn't take much to convince us. None of us wanted to sit there feeling paranoid. So we grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the edge of the woods where the sound had come from. The creek was beside us, gurgling softly as we walked along its bank, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles and wet leaves. The forest around us was thick with shadows, and every rustle in the trees made my heart skip a beat. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The flashlight beams flickered in the darkness, cutting through the blackness in short, sharp bursts. We walked deeper into the woods, pushing through the dense underbrush. The air was cold and damp now, and the smells of the forest seemed heavier, richer, more intense. I started to feel like we were in a place that didn't belong to us, a place that didn't want us there. "I don't like this," I said, my voice tight. "Maybe we should go back." But it was too late. We were already too far in. That's when we heard it again, a snap of a branch. Closer this time. I froze. Matt and Alex stopped too, their flashlights swinging in every direction, looking for anything that could explain the sound. But there was nothing, just trees, just the sound of the creek, and then nothing, complete silence. We stood there for what felt like forever, straining our ears, our breaths held tight. But nothing happened. The forest seemed to close in on us, pressing down with a suffocating weight. Finally, Matt spoke up, his voice low but forced. "All right, maybe we've seen enough. Let's head back." We didn't argue. We turned around and began to make our way back to camp, the air feeling even colder now. The firelight in the distance looked comforting, a beacon in the dark. But the closer we got to the clearing, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When we reached the edge of the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was something off about the camp. The fire had burned down to just embers, but it wasn't that. It was the way the gear was scattered around, the way the tents looked like they'd been disturbed. "Someone's been here," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. Matt's flashlight swept across the campsite, landing on our backpacks. They had been moved, scattered in a way that didn't look natural. And there, just beside the fire pit, was something I never expected to see. A set of footprints, fresh in the soft dirt, leading off into the trees. We didn't stick around to figure out what they meant. In a panic, we grabbed our things as quickly as we could, shoving everything into our packs. The thought of spending another minute in those woods was unbearable. We rushed back toward the trailhead, our flashlights cutting through the trees in quick, frantic movements. Every snap of a twig, every rustling sound made us jump, and every minute felt like an hour. We didn't stop until we reached the car. I don't know if I've ever felt such relief in my life. As we drove away, we all stayed silent, eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror, half expecting someone, or something, to be following us. When we finally hit the highway, the tension started to ease. We didn't look back, not once. I don't know who or what had been out there with us, but I know one thing for sure. It wasn't just a coincidence. Something had been watching us, waiting, but we were lucky. We got out. It's been months since that weekend, but every time I think about it, I get that feeling again. The one where you know you weren't alone. The one where you wonder if the woods ever forget. The night had already fallen as I settled in beside the campfire. The last sliver of sunlight had long since disappeared beyond the horizon, and the fire was the only thing that kept the cold and the dark at bay. Around me, the woods felt alive with a strange stillness, only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves or the snap of a branch in the distance. I had decided to go camping alone, hoping for some quiet time away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. I'd chosen a remote spot in the woods, far enough off the beaten path that I knew I wouldn't run into anyone. The kind of place where you can truly disconnect. It was a decision I'd regret soon enough. At first, everything had seemed perfect. The weather was cool but not too cold. The breeze was gentle, and the only sound was the chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Setting up camp had been easy, and as the fire crackled, I felt a calmness settling over me. I sat back against a tree, looking up at the stars, which seemed to fill the entire sky. There were no city lights here, just the kind of darkness that swallows everything. But as the night deepened, that calmness began to waver. The air around me felt heavier, as if something was watching. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps, just a faint crunch of twigs on the forest floor. But each time I turned my head, the shadows were still. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I'd been out here alone for hours, and the isolation was starting to get to me. I checked my watch. 9:45 p.m. There was no way I was going to bed anytime soon, not with the strange feeling crawling over me. I stood up and added more wood to the fire, watching the flames dance higher into the night. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one here. The woods felt dense, more so than they had earlier in the day. The trees loomed over me like silent sentinels, their twisted branches stretching out as if to grasp at the sky. Every now and then, a gust of wind would send a shiver through the leaves, but for the most part, the forest was eerily quiet. It wasn't until I noticed the scent that I started to really feel uneasy. At first, I thought it was just the smell of the burning wood, but as I breathed in, there was something off. It wasn't the earthy, smoky scent I'd expect from a campfire. It was sour, almost rotten, like something dead was nearby. I stood up, scanning the dark edges of the woods, straining my eyes to see through the shifting shadows. I didn't know what I was looking for, but there was something unsettling about the silence around me. I reached for the flashlight in my bag, clicked it on, and shined it out into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the twisted trunks of trees and a few low-hanging branches. I tried to shake it off. My mind was just playing tricks, right? I was tired. I hadn't eaten much that day. I'd been running on caffeine and the excitement of getting out into the wilderness. But then the rustling came again, closer this time, the sound of someone moving through the brush. My heart skipped a beat, and my grip tightened on the flashlight. The firelight flickered and danced, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but still, there was nothing. I listened closely, but the rustling had stopped. Only the crackling of the fire remained. Maybe it was a deer, maybe it was just some other animal, but there was an unsettling feeling that I couldn't shake off. The air felt thick, and the shadows seemed to move in ways that didn't make sense. I decided to call it a night, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. I grabbed my sleeping bag from the tent and unrolled it next to the fire. It wasn't the most comfortable arrangement, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched while inside the tent. I needed to stay near the light just in case. The fire slowly dimmed as the night wore on, but I couldn't sleep. Every crack of a twig, every whisper of wind, made me jump. Something was out there, I was sure of it. I tried to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that filled me, telling myself it was all in my head. but I couldn't shake the feeling. Just as I was about to close my eyes and try to sleep, the rustling sound came again, this time much closer. And this time it wasn't just a few twigs. It was a steady crunch, like something or someone was moving toward me, slowly but deliberately. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, and grabbed the flashlight. I shined it in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing, just the shadows of the trees, stretching long and dark in the night. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the rustling had stopped. Then I heard it, a low, scraping sound, almost like claws dragging across the ground. I snapped the beam of light toward the sound, but once again, nothing. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stood up, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. I couldn't just sit there. I had to find out what was out there. I grabbed my bag, quickly stuffed it with essentials: flashlight, knife, water bottle, and started walking cautiously toward the tree line, keeping the fire behind me. I didn't know why I felt like I needed to investigate. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right, that something was out there, and I had to know what it was. The woods felt different now. The air was thick with tension, and every step I took seemed to make the darkness close in around me. I tried to focus on the sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves. But it was as though those sounds were fading, being swallowed up by the heavy silence. I came to a stop at the edge of the clearing, shining the flashlight in every direction. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just trees and shadows. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe I just startled it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just an animal. Whatever was out there wasn't normal. And then I saw it. A shadow. A shape moving just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. For a split second, I thought it was a person, but then it shifted too fast, too fluidly. Whatever it was, it wasn't human. My heart pounded in my chest, and I backed away, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I couldn't tell what it was, but I knew one thing. I had to get back to the camp. Fast. I turned and ran, not looking back, not daring to see if it was following me. The crunch of my footsteps was the only thing I could hear, and the trees seemed to close in on me as I ran. I burst into the clearing where my camp had been, only to find the fire had almost gone out, reduced to little more than embers. I quickly added more wood to the fire, but as I knelt down to feed the flames, I heard it. The sound of something heavy breathing, right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the dark forest, watching, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the fire, too scared to move. The night felt endless, and with every crackle of the flames, I wondered if I was hearing footsteps again, creeping closer. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I saw it. The shape, no longer a shadow, emerged from the woods. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it moved with a strange, jerky motion. I couldn't see its face, but its silhouette was enough to send a cold chill down my spine. And then, as if it realized I had seen it, it stopped. It just stood there, watching me, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I held my breath, terrified, but it didn't move any closer. After what felt like an eternity, it turned and retreated back into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. As soon as I was sure it was gone, I grabbed my stuff, packed up the camp, and left. I didn't even look back. I don't know what I encountered that night. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I've never gone back into those woods, and I never will. I had always been someone who loved the idea of getting away from the noise of the world. The constant buzzing of my phone, the pressure from work, the clutter of city life, it all got to me. I decided that a weekend in the woods, by myself, would be the perfect way to recharge. No distractions, no interruptions. Just me, the trees, the air, and the sound of nature. I packed up my tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, and some basic food supplies. Nothing too fancy, just enough to keep me going for a couple of days. I wasn't planning on doing anything extreme. I wasn't a hardcore hiker, just someone who wanted a break from the chaos. The idea of setting up camp by a quiet stream, reading a book, and maybe cooking over a fire seemed perfect. The area I picked wasn't remote, but it was secluded enough. I'd been there once before, a few years ago, with some friends. We hiked for a bit, joked around, and then left without much thought. But now, doing it alone felt different, a little more daunting, but still, I convinced myself I'd be fine. I arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon, just as the sun was hanging lazily above the horizon. The trail was well maintained, and a few cars were parked in the small lot. Nothing unusual. It looked like the kind of place where families come for a short walk or a quick picnic. I smiled, happy that I wasn't too far removed from civilization. The weather was perfect, sunny but cool, with just enough of a breeze to keep things comfortable. I grabbed my pack, put on my boots, and set off down the trail. The path wound its way through thick forest. Tall pines and oaks stretched above me, their branches filtering the light into soft, dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds were chirping, squirrels darted across the path, and the occasional rustling of leaves reminded me I wasn't alone. I wasn't afraid, not at first. There's something soothing about nature when you're used to the concrete jungle of the city. But as I walked, something started to niggle at the back of my mind. It was a sense I couldn't quite put into words, like the woods were watching me, a feeling of being observed. The sensation was subtle, almost like when someone is standing too close behind you, but you can't see them. I paused, looking around, but there was nothing unusual, just trees, rocks, and the winding trail. Shaking it off, I continued deeper into the forest. After about an hour of walking, the path narrowed. The woods felt denser now, the trees crowding in on either side, their thick trunks casting shadows that seemed to grow longer as the sun dipped lower. It was getting quieter too. The birds had stopped singing, and the usual rustling of wildlife had faded. There was no sound now, except for the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I reached a small clearing and decided to set up camp near the stream that cut through the area. The sound of the water was calming, and I thought it would be nice to fall asleep to the gentle flow of it. I started unpacking, setting up my tent in a small patch of grass just off the edge of the water. By the time I finished setting everything up, it was getting late. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the sky in rich hues of pink and orange. I felt a sense of satisfaction seeing my camp all set up. It was just me out here, no one to bother me, no responsibilities. I built a small fire with the dry wood I gathered from around the area and sat back, watching the flames flicker. There was something almost hypnotic about the fire. How it moved, how it danced, how it seemed to reflect the last light of the day. I pulled out a book from my bag, intending to relax, but the silence of the forest kept pulling my attention. It was too quiet now. I kept hearing rustling sounds in the bushes, just at the edge of my vision. It was probably an animal, I told myself. A raccoon, maybe, or a deer moving through the underbrush. But each time I tried to focus on the sounds, they would stop, and I'd be left with nothing but the crackling of the fire and the occasional ripple from the stream. The night deepened, and the temperature dropped. I added more wood to the fire, trying to keep the warmth around me. There was something unsettling about the way the night had settled in, thick and heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to shrug off the feeling of unease. It wasn't anything. I was just tired. It had been a long day. I reached for my flashlight and shone it across the clearing. The beam sliced through the darkness, catching the edges of trees and rocks, but beyond that, The woods were swallowed up by blackness. That's when I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees, maybe. But when I blinked, it didn't move. It was standing just at the edge of the trees, right on the far side of the clearing. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, with a broad frame. But it wasn't shaped like a person. It was too angular, like the branches of the trees themselves had formed into a shape, twisting and bending in unnatural ways. I couldn't make out any details, just the dark outline of it. My heart pounded, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced. Had someone else come out here? Had someone been watching me this whole time? I blinked again, and the figure was gone. I sat frozen for a few moments, my pulse racing. It had to have been a trick of the shadows. That's all it was. I convinced myself of that, even as my hands trembled slightly when I reached for the flashlight again. I swept the light across the clearing, then across the edge of the forest, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, silent woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The fire crackled and popped, but I could no longer focus on it. My mind kept drifting back to that figure in the woods. What had I seen? It wasn't a person, but it had been something. I forced myself to stand, deciding that maybe I just needed a walk. I grabbed my jacket and slipped out of the camp, flashlight in hand. Maybe I'd find whatever had been making that rustling sound earlier. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. The woods around me seemed even quieter now. My boots crunched lightly on the path as I made my way back into the trees. The light from the fire behind me faded quickly, swallowed up by the thickening darkness. I walked for a few minutes, scanning the trees and underbrush with the flashlight, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds. I stopped for a moment, listening. Nothing. Then I heard it. A snap of a twig. It was close. Too close. I spun around, shining the light wildly, but there was no one.
No creature.
Just the trees, standing still and silent. I didn't dare take another step. The hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. Then it came again. The sound of something big, moving in the trees behind me. I whipped around, but this time there was no mistaking it. There was something there. Something was watching me. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my backpack, and the quiet of the woods. I had been looking forward to it for months, longing for a break from the noise of everyday life. I'd been camping before, but this time I decided to go solo, hiking out into the deeper part of the forest, away from the usual crowds. The drive was uneventful, the weather warm but not too hot, and I could already feel the tension in my shoulders easing as I left the main roads behind. The trees grew denser, taller, their branches thick with leaves. I parked my car at the trailhead, a small dirt lot with just a few cars parked at odd angles. Nothing fancy. I packed light, just the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, a small stove for cooking, and enough water and food to last a couple of days. I wanted to get back to basics. The trail began quietly, and I made my way deeper into the woods. The ground beneath my boots was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled of earth and fresh growth. I didn't think much about it, but looking back, I probably should have noticed how silent the woods were. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of my footsteps crunching along the path. I hiked for hours, following the well-marked trail, taking in the scenery, trying to shake off the stress that had been building up in my life. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside a creek and decided it was the perfect spot to set up camp. I found a spot just off the bank where the ground was level, and the sound of the flowing water helped calm my mind. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and started a fire. The flames crackled and flickered, casting long shadows on the trees around me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I ate a simple meal, pasta with some canned meat, sitting cross-legged by the fire. The stillness of the night wrapped around me like a blanket. I couldn't recall the last time I'd been this far removed from everything. When darkness fully settled in, the world seemed to hold its breath. I could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle change in the air. The fire was still burning brightly, but the woods around me felt different, more alive somehow. The occasional rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot. I told myself it was just wildlife, nothing to worry about. But there was something off about it. I grabbed my flashlight from my bag and shone it into the woods, scanning the trees. Nothing. Still, a nagging feeling crawled under my skin. I brushed it off as paranoia, a side effect of being alone in the wilderness at night. But then I heard it, a faint sound just at the edge of the campfire's glow. A soft, almost imperceptible rustling. Not the usual movement of small animals, but something heavier, something bigger. My pulse quickened. I froze, listening. Came again. This time I was certain. A footstep. A deliberate, heavy footstep. I reached for my knife, not that I thought it would be much help against whatever was out there. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and shone the flashlight toward the sound. There was nothing, just shadows stretching out from the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the sensation of being watched wouldn't go away. I sat back down by the fire, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing into the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. The night stretched on, and I eventually convinced myself to sleep. The fire burned low, and I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. I told myself that I was being foolish. It was just an animal or maybe a hiker, though the trail had been empty when I arrived. My eyes were heavy, and the peaceful sounds of the creek helped me drift off. I woke up in the middle of the night. There was something wrong. I couldn't place it at first, but then I realized the forest was silent. Not a single rustle of leaves, no distant calls of animals, not even the normal hum of insects. The stillness was unnerving, unnatural. I lay still, listening. My breath caught when I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from outside the tent, like something or someone dragging something heavy across the ground. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any other sounds. Nothing. My heart was in my throat. I had to make a decision. I could lie here, pretending it wasn't happening, hoping whatever it was would go away. Or I could confront it, whatever it was, and risk making things worse. I didn't want to find out what would happen if I ignored it. With trembling hands, I reached for the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face, but it didn't matter. I stepped out, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The fire had long since burned out, and the forest around me was pitch black. The scraping noise stopped. Dead silence. I scanned the area, flashlight shaking in my hand, but all I saw were the trees and the flickering shadows cast by the dying embers of the fire. There was no sign of anything, no trail, no movement. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was nothing. Just animals, maybe a bear dragging something through the brush. It was probably just a tree branch. But then I saw it, a pair of eyes gleaming in the dark, not far from the edge of the clearing, staring at me from the shadows. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I didn't know if it was some wild animal, a deer or something else, but the eyes didn't move. They just stared, unblinking. I knew deep down that this was no animal. I took a step back, then another, but my foot caught on something. A root, maybe, and I stumbled, hitting the ground with a thud. The eyes blinked, slowly, almost like it had been waiting for me to make a move. That was enough. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and I bolted back to the tent. I didn't stop to grab anything, didn't stop to think. I just ran. I was halfway to the tent when I heard the sound again, the scraping noise, louder this time, closer. I dove into the tent, scrambling to zip it up, praying it would hold. The tent shuddered as something or someone bumped against the fabric from the outside. I held my breath, still and silent, my hands clutching the flashlight. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, to get out of the woods, but I had no idea where to go. The trail was miles away, and I couldn't risk running blindly through the dark. Not with whatever was out there. I had to wait for morning. Hours passed. The night dragged on in a blur of anxiety. Every rustle outside made my heart leap into my throat. Every bump against the tent made me think I was done for. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't sleep. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I didn't waste a second. I packed up what I could, leaving most of my gear behind. I didn't care. I just wanted out. I didn't look back, not once. I made it back to the car by midday, drenched in sweat, shaking, but alive. That night, I slept in the car, parked near the trailhead, far from the woods. I thought about what had happened, what I had heard, what I had seen, but there was no explanation that made sense. There were no footprints, no signs of any animals. It was as if whatever had been out there didn't want to be found. I never went back to that forest, and I never will. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me and my best friend, Mark, out in the woods. Nothing fancy, no huge tents, no complicated gear. Just a simple camping trip to get away from the noise of the city, to enjoy some fresh air, and to disconnect for a couple of days. We had been talking about doing this for months, and finally, everything lined up. The weather was perfect, the campsite was remote enough to feel secluded, and we were excited. We set up our small tents in the middle of a dense forest, somewhere in the Appalachian Range, not far from a small trailhead. It wasn't a popular spot, which was exactly what we wanted. We had the place to ourselves, or so we thought. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sounds of birds and the wind rustling through the trees started to fade. That's when I first felt it, the silence. A thick kind of silence, almost unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. We built a fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound now. Mark poked at the flames with a stick, and I stared into the flickering light, not really thinking about anything. The wind picked up, sending a chill through the air. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and glanced at the darkening trees surrounding us. The firelight barely reached beyond our little camp. "Don't you think it's a little too quiet out here?" I asked, more out of a passing thought than anything else. Mark shrugged, not looking up. "Nah, man. It's just a quiet night in the woods." Maybe it was just me. I had always been sensitive to sounds in the dark. Growing up in the city, you never truly knew silence. Out here, it felt different. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get when the world is at peace. It felt more like a warning, like the woods were waiting for something. As the night dragged on, the fire began to die down. We sat by it for a little while longer, but eventually, Mark turned in for the night. I stayed outside a bit, watching the stars through the trees. The air smelled fresh, earthy, like rain was coming, but the sky above was clear. It felt peaceful again, but that nagging feeling at the back of my head never quite went away. I crawled into my tent a little while later, zipping it up and settling into my sleeping bag. I had just started to drift off when I heard it. A twig snapped in the distance. I froze. At first, I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, a raccoon. But then it came again. A sharp crack of wood breaking underfoot, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. It was too deliberate, too controlled to be a simple animal. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved farther away, but only slightly. It wasn't just an animal. Whatever it was trying to be quiet, moving with purpose. I sat up, heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I poked my head out of the tent, straining my eyes in the darkness, but the firelight barely reached more than 10 feet into the trees. The night was suffocating, the woods a dense, shadowy mass. I couldn't see anything. The sounds stopped. I wasn't sure if I imagined it or if something was really out there, but that unsettling sensation remained. I lay back down, trying to ignore it. Mark had fallen asleep almost immediately, snoring lightly, unaware of anything strange. The hours seemed to stretch on, each one feeling longer than the last. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I was jolted awake again, this time by the unmistakable sound of footsteps right outside my tent. My heart thudded in my chest. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing. Whoever or whatever was out there, I couldn't see them, but I could hear the heavy, slow steps as they circled our camp. The crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot was loud in the otherwise dead air. I told myself it was just a person, a fellow camper, maybe, but something about the rhythm of the steps felt off. There was no conversation, no noise other than the footsteps. The air seemed to grow colder, the darkness thicker. It felt like hours before the steps finally faded away. But I still couldn't relax. Every little noise, every rustling of the trees or snap of a twig made my skin crawl. When the sun began to rise, I couldn't wait to leave. Mark woke up and stretched, still groggy, asking if I was okay. I nodded, but I didn't want to talk about what had happened during the night. I just wanted to pack up and get out. We made breakfast quickly, packed up our stuff, and started heading back toward the trailhead. But as we walked, the feeling of being watched never left. The forest felt like a maze of eyes hidden in the shadows, always just out of sight. We stopped at the nearby creek for a rest. Mark wandered off to find a good spot to take a photo, but I stayed behind, just sitting by the water, trying to clear my head. That's when I heard it again. A voice, barely a whisper, coming from the direction Mark had gone. I stood up, heart pounding. I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking that someone, or something, was out there, speaking softly in the woods. I called out for Mark, but there was no response. Panic set in. I ran toward where I had last seen him, calling his name again. I burst through the trees, finding him standing motionless in the middle of the clearing. His face was pale, his eyes wide, but there was no sign of the person who had been speaking. He looked at me, his voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear it?" I nodded, throat dry. "Yeah, I heard it too." We didn't stick around much longer. Mark was shaken, and so was I. We packed up the rest of our stuff and made our way back to the trailhead, not once looking back at the woods behind us. When we finally reached the car, we both let out a breath we hadn't realized we were holding. The normal world felt miles away, but the eerie presence in the woods still lingered in my mind. We didn't talk much on the drive back, both of us processing what had happened, but neither of us could make sense of it. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe it was someone else out there. But whatever it was real. It wasn't some campfire ghost story. It was something that I couldn't explain. Something that stayed with me long after we had left the woods behind. And that was the last time I ever went camping in those woods. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I needed a break from everything. The noise, the pressure, the endless cycle of work, errands, and social obligations. I found an old, secluded campground online. It wasn't too far from home, but far enough that it felt like I was leaving the city behind. The reviews said it was quiet and rarely crowded. Perfect, I thought. I arrived Friday afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. The campground was tucked away in a dense forest, the kind that swallowed sound, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of birds breaking the silence. There were only a few other cars in the parking area. A couple tents, a small camper here and there. It seemed like the ideal place to unwind, to be alone with my thoughts for a couple of days. I set up my tent in a small clearing, not far from a creek. The water was clear, running smoothly, its soft gurgle blending with the hum of insects. I unpacked my gear, laid out a small fire pit, and hung up my hammock between two strong trees. It felt like paradise, the weight of the world sliding off my shoulders as I worked. I made a fire, the flames crackling to life, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The first night was calm, too calm almost. The only sounds came from the fire and the occasional splash of water from the creek. The sky was clear, stars scattered across the blackness like someone had dumped salt across a dark velvet cloth. I roasted some marshmallows and made s'mores, the warmth of the fire contrasting with the cool air that rolled in as night fell. I felt a sense of peace, thinking how lucky I was to have this experience, to be away from everything. As the fire burned low, I retreated into my tent and zipped it up. I lay down on my sleeping bag, listening to the night, letting it surround me. My eyes fluttered shut, and the world faded away. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch scraping against the side of my tent or an animal moving through the woods. But then it came again, louder this time. A distinct, soft thud. Not a branch. It sounded like someone walking, but the steps weren't like a normal human stride. They were uneven, irregular, as if someone or something was stumbling through the underbrush. I lay perfectly still, trying to listen, trying to make sense of it. My heart was beating faster now, adrenaline slowly creeping into my veins. The thudding grew closer, slow but steady. I could feel my breath quicken, my body tense. The sounds were too deliberate to be an animal. I told myself it was probably just another camper, maybe someone who had wandered off the path. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I peered through the mesh of my tent. Nothing. The forest was black beyond the faint glow of my lantern, which I had left hanging outside. The thudding stopped suddenly. For a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. Then, just as suddenly, I heard a soft rustling, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, not daring to make a sound, and flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, cutting across the trees, the brush, but there was nothing there. The clearing was empty. I lay back down, telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in the woods. Every little noise could be amplified in my head. The sounds of nature had a way of turning normal things into something unfamiliar. But sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about those footsteps, the uneven rhythm. I wondered if it could have been a person, maybe someone who had gotten lost. But how had they gotten so close without me hearing them until now? The next morning, I woke early, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest. The campground was still quiet. The only sounds were the birds chirping and the creek flowing steadily. I had barely slept, but I decided to shake off my unease and start the day. I needed to focus on something, anything, to get my mind off what happened last night. I packed up my gear and headed for the trail. The morning mist hung low over the ground. The trees dripped with moisture. It was beautiful in an eerie way. I started walking, listening to the crunch of the dirt beneath my boots, the sound of the forest coming alive with the new day. But my mind kept drifting back to the night. What had I heard? Who was out there? I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. The more I walked, the more I convinced myself that it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something else moving through the forest. It was easy to tell myself that, especially with how remote the area was. There were no other campsites around, no houses, just forest for miles in every direction. By late afternoon, I had wandered far from my campsite. I decided to loop back, knowing that I had to get back before dark. The hike back was uneventful, though a little unsettling. The feeling of being watched started creeping over me again. The trees felt too thick, too close together. The trail seemed less familiar. When I reached my campsite, it was around dusk. As I stepped into the clearing, my breath caught. My tent was exactly as I had left it, but the fire pit, it was disturbed. The rocks around it had been moved. The logs I had stacked for firewood were scattered. I hadn't noticed this when I left, but now it was so obvious. My gut twisted in a way I didn't like. I checked the rest of the campsite. Everything was in place except for one thing. My hammock was gone. It wasn't just unhooked. It was completely missing. My heart pounded, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. This wasn't a joke. Someone had been here. Someone had been in my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around, the beams slicing through the darkening woods. I couldn't see anyone, but that didn't mean they weren't there. The thought of someone else being in the woods with me, watching me, maybe even waiting for me to get comfortable again, made my skin crawl. I spent the next hour checking the area, looking for tracks or signs that someone had been there. There was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches. The forest around me seemed still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but I couldn't stay there anymore. I gathered what little I had left, stuffing it into my backpack. But just as I turned to leave, I heard it again. The thud, that same uneven footstep sound. I froze. This time I wasn't alone. I didn't wait to see who or what was out there. I ran, as fast as I could, down the trail, my heart hammering in my chest. The thuds followed me, growing louder, closer. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, my legs pumping faster. I could hear the branches snapping behind me now, the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, pursuing me. I didn't dare look back. Couldn't. Every part of my mind screamed at me to run faster, to escape. I rounded a corner, almost tripping over a rock, and saw the campground clearing ahead. My car was there. The sight of it was the only thing that gave me any relief. I made it to the parking lot in what felt like seconds, gasping for breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I got in, slammed the door, and locked it. I started the car and drove away without looking back, the thuds still echoing in my mind. By the time I reached the highway, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't stop, not until I was miles away, until the campsite and whatever had happened there was far behind me. When I finally pulled into a gas station, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the dark, trying to calm my shaking hands. I didn't know who or what had been following me that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. The woods weren't a peaceful retreat. They weren't a place to find solace or escape. They were a place where something else could be lurking, waiting for you to get comfortable, waiting for you to let your guard down. And that's the last mistake I ever made. I had never really enjoyed camping. It wasn't that I was afraid of the outdoors. It was more the isolation that bothered me. The feeling of being cut off from the world, where your safety and comfort depend on nothing more than the thin layer of a tent and the mercy of the elements. But this trip, something about it felt different. Maybe it was the fact that I was alone for the first time in ages. My friends had backed out, leaving me with a solo adventure in the woods. I figured I could handle it, though. I had done my research, packed my gear, and had everything I needed, or so I thought. The drive to the campsite was long and winding, with each turn taking me deeper into a forest that looked the same: dense trees, unbroken canopies, and long stretches of silence. The road became more uneven as I got farther from civilization, the smooth asphalt turning into a gravel path that crunched under my tires. The air felt fresher here, more alive somehow. But there was something else, too. A heaviness, like the weight of an old secret the forest kept hidden. I parked at the edge of a clearing, looking out over a wide, shallow lake. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows that made everything seem a little darker than it should have been. I unloaded my gear, setting up the tent by the water's edge. It wasn't long before the cool evening breeze kicked in, and I was reminded of how quickly the woods could change. The silence was deafening. No birds, no animals, not even the hum of insects. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily. The campfire crackled as I started cooking dinner, the smell of grilled meat filling the air. But something still didn't sit right. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me, the way it always did when I was alone in unfamiliar places. After a while, the sun finally disappeared completely, and the light around me faded to dark blue. The fire flickered in the growing darkness, casting dancing shadows that stretched long on the ground. I sat back in my folding chair, listening to the distant sound of rustling leaves. It almost sounded like footsteps, but I dismissed it as the wind playing with the branches. That's when I heard it, a loud crack, like a tree branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The fire was the only light, and everything outside its circle of warmth was pure blackness. Couldn't see a thing. I scanned the area, my eyes straining, but there was nothing. No movement, just the darkness. After a long moment of nothing happening, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Probably just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. I added more logs to the fire and tried to focus on something else. But my nerves were shot now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night dragged on in that uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional snap of wood from the fire. I eventually crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly and pulling the sleeping bag around me for warmth. But sleep wouldn't come. Every little sound outside seemed amplified, my heart racing at the smallest rustle. And then, in the middle of the night, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. This time, they were closer. I held my breath, straining to listen, but there was nothing more, just the sound of my pulse hammering in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal moving around, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound was deliberate. Someone or something was out there. The hours passed in a blur of sleepless tension. Finally, with the first light of dawn, I decided I had to find out what was going on. I quietly unzipped the tent and peered out, my eyes darting around the campsite. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only the faintest glow. The lake was eerily still, the surface reflecting the pale sky above. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped cautiously toward the tree line. The damp earth beneath my boots was soft, the air cool and damp from the overnight chill. The woods seemed empty, too empty. I walked slowly, scanning the area for any sign of movement, any clue to explain the noises I'd heard. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, catching on branches, leaves, and the occasional patch of underbrush. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. A set of footprints. They were fresh, the edges still crisp, as if someone had walked through the wet ground just moments before. But these weren't the prints of an animal. They were human. My stomach tightened. I wasn't sure why, but seeing those prints made everything feel so much worse. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I had the overwhelming urge to turn around, to leave immediately. But I couldn't bring myself to. There was a morbid curiosity that gripped me, urging me forward. I followed the trail of footprints deeper into the woods. They wound around trees and over rocks, leading me further away from the campsite. The forest felt different now, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was waiting for me, hidden just out of sight. And then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time they weren't behind me. They were ahead, moving parallel to me through the woods. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam shaking erratically. The footsteps paused, and for a moment, there was nothing. The woods were dead silent. I slowly, cautiously, raised my flashlight to the area where I thought the sound had come from. My heart stopped when the beam of light fell across something in the trees. It wasn't a person, but it was close. A figure, hunched low against the trunk of a large oak tree, was watching me. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see enough. The figure was clothed in tattered clothes, dirty and ragged as if they'd been living out here for weeks, maybe months. The most unsettling thing, though, was the eyes. They were wide open, staring directly at me, unmoving, unblinking. For a moment, neither of us moved, couldn't breathe. The world seemed to stop, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, the figure disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the underbrush without a sound. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. My legs burned as I sprinted through the woods, my feet slipping on the wet ground, but I didn't stop. The thought of what I had seen, the figure in the woods, made every cell in my body scream for me to escape. I had no idea how long I ran, how far, but eventually, I broke out of the trees and into the clearing where I had set up camp. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my gear and shoved it into the car, throwing things in haphazardly, not caring if I left anything behind. I didn't care about the campsite or the tent or the fire. All I cared about was getting away from that place. As I drove away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods stretched behind me, silent and still. But deep down, I knew something was out there, something that had been watching me, following me, waiting for me to leave. I didn't go back to that campsite. I didn't even tell anyone what happened. They would have laughed at me, called it a trick of the mind, maybe said I'd had too much to drink. But I knew what I saw, and I knew that whatever it was in those woods, it was still there, waiting for the next person to wander too far off the path. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, a break from the grind, a couple of days to get away from everything. Just me, my tent, and the woods. At least that's what I had in mind when I packed my gear and set off. The drive to the campsite wasn't anything special. Nothing scenic or awe-inspiring about it. Just long stretches of highway, occasional turns into dirt roads, and then a small, familiar sign that marked the entrance to the forest. I camped here before, many times actually. It was a place I knew well, maybe a little too well if I'm being honest, but that's what made it perfect for escaping reality. I parked at the edge of the campsite, threw my backpack on, and hiked down the familiar trail. The trees around me seemed to grow taller, their branches stretching out above me like fingers reaching for the sky. The air was crisp, fresh with the scent of pine. A light breeze rustled the leaves, but aside from that, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel alone, but in a way that's peaceful, safe. I set up my tent by the stream, not far from the path, but far enough that I could still feel secluded. It was a spot I'd used before. The sound of water flowing nearby always helped me sleep. As I worked, the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The forest seemed to change in that moment. The air felt heavier, like the trees were watching. It wasn't anything I hadn't noticed before, but tonight, it was different. The woods felt alive. I brushed it off as nothing more than a momentary unease. It was probably the isolation, the fading daylight, the way the shadows twisted around the trunks of the trees. I had set up camp dozens of times here, after all. There was no reason to worry. As darkness fell, I built a small fire. The crackling of the flames was a comforting sound, and the warmth it provided was welcome against the evening chill. I sat back in my camping chair, eating the simple meal I'd brought along. Everything was calm, too calm, maybe. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, as if expecting someone to be standing there, watching me. But of course, there was no one. Just the trees and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Nightfall fully took over, and I retreated into my tent, the firelight still flickering from outside. My sleeping bag was warm, and the soft rustling of the forest around me gradually lulled me into a sense of drowsiness. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a small sound, almost like a branch snapping far off in the distance. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time, and then again even closer still. My heart rate quickened. The sound was unmistakable now. Footsteps, crunching through the underbrush. Someone or something was out there. I told myself it was probably just another camper, maybe someone else on the same trail, just a little too close for comfort. But the footsteps didn't stop. They came closer, slow and deliberate, just outside the reach of the firelight. My breathing caught in my throat. I reached for the pocket knife I always carried with me when I camped, clutching it in my hand as I peered out through the small opening in the tent. Nothing, no one, just the dark, endless trees. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were right there, as if whoever it was waiting, just out of sight. The wind shifted, and suddenly the trees seemed to groan. I froze, listening intently, waiting. My instincts told me to stay still, to remain silent. If I moved, I would make myself an easy target. But for what? The footsteps came again, this time from directly behind me. My blood ran cold. I didn't dare to move. My entire body went rigid with fear. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, louder than any sound in the forest. Sweat slicked my palms, and the knife in my hand felt useless, a small comfort in the face of whatever was out there. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The forest went completely still. I waited and waited, my breath shallow, my eyes never leaving the dark expanse outside the tent. Nothing. No more footsteps, no more sounds. I couldn't explain it. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that my mind had just played tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something or someone was out there, watching me, waiting. I spent the next few hours in a restless daze. Every time I thought I drifted off, I would hear something, the tiniest of sounds, and I'd snap awake, heart racing. But every time I checked, there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just the wind and the whispering trees. When morning finally came, I felt both relief and dread. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting pale light over the forest. I had survived the night, but I wasn't sure if I felt safer. I packed up my tent as quickly as I could, eager to leave. I wasn't sure what had happened during the night, but I knew I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The drive back was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Even when I pulled into my driveway, the sense of being watched lingered. I never went back to that campsite, and to this day, I still don't know what happened out there in the woods. Maybe it was just a figment of my imagination, or maybe there was something in those woods that I didn't understand. Either way, I learned one thing. Sometimes it's better not to go looking for answers. I've always loved the outdoors. The smell of pine needles, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, and the calm of being far away from the chaos of everyday life. That's why I decided to go camping alone. Some people might think it's strange or even a little reckless, but to me, it felt like the perfect escape. I chose a remote spot up in the hills, far enough from the trailheads to avoid other campers, but close enough that I wouldn't be completely alone in case something went wrong. The trail leading up to the camp was a dirt path, barely wide enough for my boots, surrounded by dense trees. My backpack was heavy, but I felt strong, the excitement of solitude giving me energy. When I arrived at the campsite, it was just as I expected, secluded and peaceful. There was a small clearing near a stream where I set up my tent. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the rocks and trees. I started a fire, the crackling of wood filling the air, and sat down to enjoy my meal. Everything was perfect, too perfect almost. That's when I first felt it. First, I thought it was just the wind. The trees creaked, the branches swayed, but there was something off about it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a kind of stillness that settled over the campsite, like the air had thickened, becoming heavier. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to shake it off. It's just the wilderness, I thought. You're alone, and your senses are on high alert. But as the fire crackled and the stars started to show in the darkening sky, I couldn't ignore the feeling. It was like I was being watched. I stood up and walked around the camp, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. I checked the edges of the clearing, my flashlight sweeping over the underbrush, but nothing moved. Still, the feeling lingered. As the night grew darker, I retired to my tent. The wind outside had picked up, the trees now bending with each gust. It was louder than I'd expected, but still I tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. The wind, once comforting, now felt oppressive, as if it carried with it something far more unsettling than the usual night noises. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves outside the tent made my heart race. I told myself it was nothing, just animals. Bears, deer, maybe even a mountain lion. But no matter how much I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the side of the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, maybe a tree branch brushing against the fabric. But it came again, and again, slowly, methodically. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I listened hard, the silence around me pressing in, making the noise seem even louder. It was too close. The tapping was deliberate, like someone, or something, was out there, just waiting for me to make a sound. I could hear my pulse in my ears. I slowly reached for the knife I kept under my pillow. It was a habit I had whenever I camped alone. A small comfort in a place that could be both beautiful and dangerous. My hand gripped the handle tight. The tent, despite its thin walls, felt like the only thing standing between me and whatever was out there. The tapping stopped suddenly, replaced by absolute silence. I tried to steady my breathing, my mind racing with possibilities. What was out there? Who was out there? I told myself it could just be a bear or another animal, but something in my gut told me it wasn't. Felt wrong. I lay there, staring at the dark fabric of the tent, willing myself to fall asleep, but the noise didn't let up. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, like something was waiting for me to make a mistake. I couldn't stay here anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent quietly, and stepped outside. The night was cold now, and the air had that sharp bite to it that comes just before the dawn. The fire had died down to a few embers, the light flickering faintly in the distance. I scanned the perimeter of the camp, but saw nothing. No footprints, no movement. I stood still, listening, but there was no sound, only the wind. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but just as I was about to turn back to the tent, something in the trees caught my eye. A shadow, a figure tall and thin, standing at the edge of the woods, just barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out any details, but it was unmistakable. It was there watching me. My stomach dropped. I froze, holding my breath. It didn't move at first, just standing there, like it was waiting for me to notice it. The shadow shifted slightly, and for a split second, I thought I saw something gleaming in its hand, but I couldn't be sure. The figure remained still. I took a slow step backward, and the figure did the same. My heart raced, and I felt the primal urge to flee. I turned and bolted for the tent, praying that I could make it back before whatever that thing was could close the distance. The camp seemed so much farther away now, the trees closing in on me as if they were alive, narrowing the path. I reached the tent and zipped it up quickly, my hands shaking. I pressed my back against the fabric and held my breath. The night was still, too still. There was no sound, no rustle of leaves.
No tapping.
Just the sound of my own heart pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, listening to every sound, every movement in the dark. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, I couldn't tell. Felt like time had stopped. Eventually, the first light of dawn broke through the trees, and the world began to feel normal again. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the woods, expecting to see something, or at least some sign that I wasn't just imagining it. But there was nothing.
No footprints.
No broken branches. No sign that anyone or anything had been there. It was as if the whole thing had been a figment of my imagination. I gathered my things, packed up the tent, and headed down the trail, the eerie feeling slowly lifting with each step I took away from that spot. I made a mental note to stay on more established campsites in the future, ones with more people, more noise. But the one thing that stuck with me was the look in that figure's eyes, or the feeling of them, at least. There was nothing supernatural about it.
No ghosts, no monsters.
Just a person out there in the woods, who for reasons I may never understand, chose to watch me. And for the rest of the trip down the trail, I kept hearing the sound of tapping on the trees, just out of sight, the rhythm never quite fading away. When I finally made it back to my car, I looked at the woods one last time. It was peaceful again, the birds singing, the sun shining through the trees. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been watching me that night was real, and that knowledge in itself was enough to make me wonder if I'd ever truly be alone in the woods again. I never thought camping could go wrong. To me, the woods were a peaceful place, a refuge from the noise of everyday life. A few of my friends and I decided to go camping in the forest just outside the city, an area we had all been to before. We'd hiked through the trails and camped a few times, so we knew what to expect. But that night, everything changed. The day had been perfect. Clear skies, cool breeze, and the comforting hum of the forest all around us. We arrived early in the afternoon, and after a short hike, we set up camp near a small clearing by a creek. I always liked being near water, even if it was just a trickle. It added a kind of life to the campsite, something other than the endless trees surrounding us. By the time the sun began setting, we had a fire going, crackling and popping, sending tendrils of smoke into the air. The flames were comforting, its warmth inviting as we sat in a circle around it. We laughed, roasted marshmallows, and talked about everything and nothing. It felt like any other camping trip we had ever taken. The fire illuminated our faces, but beyond that, everything else was swallowed by the darkness. The forest seemed to be a living, breathing thing. The rustle of leaves and distant calls of animals, the only sounds that reached us. It wasn't until after dark when things started to feel off. We were all sitting around the fire when I first heard it. A rustling sound coming from the edge of the woods, beyond the trees where the firelight couldn't reach. It wasn't a squirrel or a bird. This sound was too deliberate, too slow. I froze for a second, listening. My friends didn't seem to notice at first, too wrapped up in their conversation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. But as I sat there, my eyes kept darting to the darkened trees, waiting for any movement. Then it came again, a soft snap of a twig underfoot, followed by the faintest rustling. This time, my heart rate sped up. My gut told me something wasn't right. I tried to act normal. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice just a little too loud in the quiet night. Everyone turned to look at me. A couple of my friends shrugged, one of them dismissing it as an animal. "It's just a deer or something," they said, but there was an unease in their voices too. They didn't seem as convinced as they should have been. But then the sound came again, closer this time, almost at the edge of the camp. A slow, deliberate crunching of leaves, as if something was moving through the underbrush without trying to hide. The kind of sound you'd expect from a large animal, maybe a bear, but this wasn't quite right. The movements were too careful, too slow. It didn't sound like an animal searching for food or moving through the forest. It felt intentional. I stood up. My eyes swept the darkness. "Who's out there?" I called into the blackness. I had no idea why I asked it. There was no one. Not supposed to be, at least. Nothing. No response. Just silence. But I knew I'd heard it. Felt it in my bones. The air had thickened, weighed down by something I couldn't quite place. "Maybe it's just the wind," one of my friends offered, his voice shaky now. It didn't sound like the wind. I knew that much. We decided to investigate, though I'm not sure why. Maybe we were trying to convince ourselves it was nothing, just a raccoon or some harmless animal. But none of us were eager to leave the fire behind, especially when the woods beyond it seemed darker than I remembered. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and slowly started walking toward the sound. First, there was nothing. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the leaves rustling in a way that was almost too normal, too calm. We walked further into the woods, each of us trying to shake the unease that had started creeping up our spines. And then it happened. The crunching of leaves again, right behind us. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the shadows. The beam of light sliced through the dark but revealed nothing. Just trees and more trees. The rustling had stopped. In its place, there was an odd quiet, a kind of waiting silence that felt suffocating. We stood still for a moment, listening. The only sound was our own breathing, shallow and quick. My heart was thudding in my chest, too fast, too erratic. "Okay, let's go back," one of my friends said, his voice now sounding much more urgent. We didn't need to say it, but we all felt the same thing. Something was wrong. Something was out there. We turned to head back to camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. There was a sudden sense of being watched, as if eyes were tracking our every move from the darkness. My skin prickled. Every step felt heavier, slower, as though the ground itself was trying to hold us back. We made it back to the campsite, but none of us said anything as we sat down again, the fire now feeling much smaller than it had before. The quiet that settled over us was different, more oppressive. We didn't talk. No more jokes, no more laughter, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. That's when we noticed it. The fire had started to die down. Not in the usual way, though. It was almost like the flames were flickering more than they should have been, as if something was causing them to burn irregularly, almost too quick, too uneven. It didn't make sense, but it made my stomach drop. One of my friends went to grab another log for the fire, but when he stepped away from the campsite, we all noticed it at the same time. There was something on the edge of the clearing, a figure just beyond the reach of the firelight. Too tall to be a tree, too still to be an animal. We couldn't make out details, just a vague, human-like silhouette standing motionless in the dark. None of us moved at first. We just stared. Every instinct screamed to get up, to run, to do something, but we couldn't. And then, the figure stepped forward, just a few paces, moving slowly, deliberately. My mind raced. What did it want? Who was it? Get the gun. One of my friends whispered, his voice strained. It was something none of us had brought. None of us thought we'd need it. The figure stopped. We could hear it breathing. It was deep, heavy breathing, like someone who had been running or hiding, but it was too controlled, too deliberate. That's when I realized there was no way it was just an animal. No animal, no matter how big, would move like that. I don't know how I knew it, but in that moment, I was sure. This wasn't just a person. It wasn't just a hunter either. We didn't wait any longer. We grabbed our stuff, anything we could carry, and bolted. We didn't talk as we ran. We just ran. The sound of our feet thudding on the dirt, the crackle of the fire left behind, and the breathless, panicked gasps that filled the air. We didn't stop until we reached the road, not stopping to check if anything was following us. We never saw who or what was out there that night, but we didn't need to. I'll never forget that feeling of being hunted, like something was waiting for us to make a mistake. Something was out there in the woods, and it was just waiting for us to make the wrong move. We made it back to the city before dawn, and when we told the authorities, they found nothing. No signs of anyone having been there. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of the ordinary. They chalked it up to a wild animal, maybe a bear, maybe a person just passing through. But I know what I felt, and I'll never set foot in that forest again. The forest was quieter than usual that night. I had been camping alone for a few days, and although it was peaceful, the silence was unnerving in its own way. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches creaking softly like old bones. But other than that, there was nothing. No animals rustling in the underbrush, no distant calls from birds or coyotes. Just the faint whisper of wind and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots as I walked around the camp. It had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, this solo camping trip. No one else was supposed to be around for miles. I had set up camp by a small creek, just far enough from the trail that I couldn't hear any hikers passing by. I liked the solitude. The first day was perfect, clear skies, a cool breeze, and a warm campfire where I roasted some sausages and made a cup of coffee. The quiet was almost therapeutic. It felt good to be away from the constant noise of the city, from the endless texts, emails, and phone calls. But as the days went on, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything specific at first, just little things. A broken twig I hadn't noticed when I set up my tent. A rustling in the bushes that stopped the moment I turned around to look. But I brushed it off as animals, deer, maybe a rabbit. Even the sounds of the wind seemed to grow louder as the days passed. It wasn't until the third night that I began to feel like something was wrong. The campfire was dying down. I sat close to it, the heat of the embers pushing back against the cold air. I had just finished my dinner and was staring into the fire, listening to the occasional pop of burning wood. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch further, creeping along the ground as the flames flickered. Everything felt still, too still. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was a rustling, a movement in the underbrush, but not the kind that comes from an animal. It was deliberate, heavy, slow. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The wind had died down by then, leaving behind a silence so thick it was suffocating. The rustling continued, followed by something that sounded like a footstep, crunching leaves, a weight pressing down on the ground. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer, or maybe a bear, but I knew better. This was different. I had been in the woods enough times to recognize the difference between animal movement and something else. I stood up, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife I'd tucked into my belt. I hadn't planned on needing it, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I could see nothing through the trees, just blackness. But the rustling continued, moving closer, the footsteps now louder. There was no way it was a deer. My heart started to race. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and grabbed my flashlight. I slowly walked toward the noise, my boots crunching against the leaves, my eyes scanning the darkness. Every few steps, I'd stop and listen, hoping I'd be wrong, that whatever it was would just go away. But it didn't. I reached the edge of the camp and stopped, shining the flashlight into the woods. The beam sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The forest was still. Maybe I had imagined it? I strained my ears, waiting for any sound to confirm my fear. Then, suddenly, it came. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, ragged and uneven. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight bouncing erratically as I tried to locate the source of the sound. But all I saw was my tent, the firelight flickering behind it. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I turned off the flashlight, plunging the area into darkness again, and I ducked low, my heart hammering in my chest. The air felt heavier now, thick with tension. I could hear my breath, shallow and fast, and the soft creak of the trees. I waited, straining my ears for any sound, but nothing came. It was as if the forest had fallen completely silent again. Minutes passed, then what felt like hours. I didn't dare move, not wanting to make a sound. The longer I stayed still, the more I felt like I was being watched, like eyes were boring into me from the trees. I couldn't explain why, but every part of me was telling me to leave, to get in my car and drive home. But that would mean abandoning my camp, my gear, everything I had set up. I stayed, but my mind was racing. What if I wasn't alone out here? What if someone had been watching me from the very beginning? The night dragged on. Eventually, I mustered enough courage to slowly back toward my campfire, never taking my eyes off the trees. I kept the knife in my hand, ready for whatever might come. The air was cold now, colder than before, and the fire had almost gone out. I added a few more logs, but the light it cast was dim, like it was barely enough to ward off the darkness. I sat on the log near the fire, my back tense, eyes darting to every shadow. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. By morning, the sun had finally risen, casting a soft light through the trees. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, less oppressive. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all night. I packed up my gear in a hurry. I had planned to stay another night, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Every step I took felt like someone was right behind me, just out of sight. When I finally reached the trailhead, the weight lifted from my shoulders, but I didn't feel any safer. I still felt like I wasn't alone. The strange thing was, though, when I reached the car, I looked back one last time at the woods. The trees swayed in the breeze. The birds were chirping again. It was peaceful, normal, but the feeling still lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I didn't go camping alone again after that trip. And whenever I hear rustling in the woods now, I can't help but wonder if someone else is out there, waiting. I woke up to the kind of morning chill that settles into your bones. The kind that makes you regret ever leaving your warm bed back home. My sleeping bag had done little to keep the damp forest air at bay. The small campsite was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves overhead. The trees here seemed to stretch endlessly, their tops lost in a thick canopy. This wasn't some well-known park with marked trails and other campers within shouting distance. This was deep, isolated wilderness, a place my friend had once described as where you go to find yourself. though now I was starting to think it was where you go to lose yourself. I was alone. That had been the plan. No distractions, no obligations, just me and the forest. A kind of reset. I had parked my car a couple of miles back along a rough, overgrown trail and hiked in with just the essentials. A small tent, some food, water, a knife, and a map. The map had been my crutch, my reassurance that I wasn't completely untethered. But as I sat there on the edge of my tent, the morning sunlight barely cutting through the dense foliage, I felt more exposed than ever. After a quick breakfast of granola and some lukewarm water, I decided to explore further into the woods. I left the tent behind, taking only my knife and a water bottle. The map stayed in my pack, folded neatly. I thought I wouldn't need it for just a short walk. The forest felt alive as I moved through it, every step crunching the underbrush, every movement stirring the air. Birds chirped sporadically, their calls echoing faintly in the distance. Occasionally, a squirrel or rabbit would dart across my path, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. About an hour into my walk, I stumbled upon something strange. A clearing, almost perfectly circular, where the trees seemed to stop abruptly. The grass here was a brighter green than the rest of the forest, almost unnatural in its vibrancy. In the center of the clearing, there was a pile of rocks. Not just random stones, but stacked deliberately, like some kind of marker or cairn. I hesitated, feeling a ripple of unease. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a place this remote. I walked around the pile, inspecting it but not touching it. It didn't seem old, and the rocks were clean, free of moss or dirt. Someone had been here recently. I decided to head back to my camp. The unease stayed with me, lingering at the edges of my mind. As I retraced my steps, I began to notice small details I had missed earlier. A tree with deep claw marks on its trunk. A patch of ground where the grass was flattened as if something heavy had rested there. My heart rate picked up and I quickened my pace. The forest, once teeming with sounds, now felt oppressively quiet. Even the birds seemed to have stopped their chatter. When I reached my campsite, something was off. My tent was still there, but the flap was open. I was sure I had zipped it closed before I left. My pack, which I had left inside the tent, was now lying on the ground a few feet away. Its contents were spilled out: food wrappers, the map, a flashlight. My first thought was that an animal had gotten to it, but there were no signs of tearing or chewing. It looked more like someone had gone through it. I spent the next few hours trying to calm myself down, convincing myself it had to be an animal. I reorganized my gear, zipped the tent securely, and built a small fire. As the evening wore on, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows stretched long and dark, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my pulse jump. I kept the fire going, feeding it steadily, as if its light and warmth could somehow keep whatever was out there at bay. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd jolt awake at the slightest sound. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps. Not the quick, erratic movements of an animal, but deliberate, measured steps. They seemed to circle the campsite, just out of the firelight. I gripped my knife tightly, my hands slick with sweat, and strained to hear more. But the sounds eventually faded, leaving me in silence. When dawn finally broke, I packed up. The thrill of solitude had soured into a gnawing anxiety. I decided to cut the trip short and head back to my car. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped often, turning around to scan the forest, but saw nothing. Still, the sensation persisted, an itch I couldn't scratch. About halfway to the car, I found something that made my blood run cold. A piece of fabric snagged on a bush, dark green, the same color as my jacket. It was torn, frayed at the edges, and looked like it had been there for a while. But I hadn't walked this way before. Someone else had. quickened my pace, almost breaking into a jog. The dense forest seemed to press in tighter, the trees growing closer together. The trail, faint to begin with, was becoming harder to follow. Panic started to set in as I realized I wasn't entirely sure I was going the right way. The map, buried deep in my pack, felt useless now. Finally, I saw it, the faint outline of my car through the trees. Relief washed over me as I stumbled toward it, my legs weak and trembling. But as I approached, I froze. The driver's side door was open. I hadn't left it like that. My keys were still in my pocket, so whoever had been here hadn't hotwired it or driven off. But they'd been inside. The seat was pushed back, and the contents of the glove compartment were scattered across the floor. I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear into the back, started the engine, and sped down the rough trail, the underbrush scraping against the sides of the car. My eyes darted constantly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone burst out of the trees behind me. But the road remained empty. By the time I reached the main highway, the sun was fully up, and the dense forest had given way to open fields. I drove straight home, not stopping until I pulled into my driveway. It wasn't until I was inside, with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, that I finally let myself breathe. That night, as I lay in my own bed, I replayed everything in my head. The pile of rocks, the open tent, the footsteps, the car door. It all felt too deliberate, too calculated to be random. Someone had been out there watching me, testing me. I still don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I do know one thing. I won't be going back into the woods anytime soon.